Hello everyone, and welcome back to Terrifying Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I was walking down the quiet street, my footsteps echoing faintly against the rows of houses. The evening air was cool, and the dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. I felt relaxed until I glanced across the road and noticed a car parked there. Its headlights were off, and the vehicle sat unnervingly still. I hesitated, my mind racing as I tried to remember if it had been there when I passed earlier. It hadn't. I was sure of it. The street had been empty except for a few scattered leaves, yet now the car seemed to blend into the scenery, as if it had always been there. Continuing to walk, I kept glancing at the car out of the corner of my eye. There was no movement inside, at least none that I could see. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled, a subtle warning that something felt off. The houses lining the street were dark, their occupants likely winding down for the night. I tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Perhaps someone had just parked and gone inside, I told myself, though I couldn't ignore the gnawing unease. A sudden rustle of leaves made me stop. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but it was only the wind stirring the trees. I exhaled sharply and glanced back at the car. It hadn't moved, but now I felt certain someone was inside. I quickened my pace, the urge to get away from the car overpowering my rational thoughts. My sneakers scuffed against the pavement as I moved, but the sound was swallowed by the eerie stillness of the night. My shadow stretched long and thin under the streetlights, flickering as I passed. When I reached the corner, I stopped and glanced back at the car. It was still there, its dark silhouette blending into the shadows. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned down another street, deciding to take a longer route home. My breathing was steady, but my steps were hurried. Each time I passed a parked car or a dark alley, I felt my chest tighten. It was as if the night itself was conspiring to unsettle me. After a few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the car again. It was further back, parked at the curb, but unmistakably the same one. I hadn't heard it start or move, yet there it was, following me like a shadow. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe I was being paranoid, but my instincts told me otherwise. I gripped my phone tightly in my pocket, debating whether to call anyone for reassurance. The next street was even quieter, the silence oppressive. I quickened my pace, my shoes tapping against the concrete. The car didn't appear immediately, but I knew it was there, lurking just out of sight. My mind raced with possibilities, each more unnerving than the last. Suddenly, I heard the faint hum of an engine behind me. I didn't dare look back, my body frozen in fear. The sound grew louder, and I knew the car was approaching. My heart pounded as I moved to the side of the road, trying to stay calm. The car slowed as it passed, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. It rolled by at a crawl, as if whoever was inside wanted me to know they were watching. My hands were trembling as I gripped my phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the call button. Once the car passed, I waited for it to speed off, but it didn't. It stopped a few yards ahead, its engine still running. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I realized I had no idea what to do. Turning back wasn't an option, but walking past it felt equally dangerous. I stepped into the shadows of a nearby tree, trying to make myself less visible. My breath came in shallow gasps as I watched the car. The driver didn't get out, but the engine idled, a low, menacing hum that filled the silence. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally moved. It turned down another street and disappeared from view. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. I didn't trust that it was over. I stayed in the shadows, waiting to see if it would return. Minutes passed, and the street remained empty. I forced myself to move, my legs stiff and unsteady. I needed to get home, but every step felt like a gamble. The silence around me was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. When I reached my street, I thought I was safe. My house was just a few doors away, its porch light a beacon of safety. But as I approached, I saw the car again. It was parked a few houses down, its headlights still off, waiting like a predator. I froze, unsure of what to do. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed. The ringing seemed to echo in the still night as I glanced nervously at the car. When someone finally answered, I whispered my location and the situation. The operator assured me help was on the way, but it felt like hours before I saw flashing lights in the distance. The car sped off the moment the police arrived, disappearing into the night. I couldn't describe the driver, couldn't explain why they had been following me. The officers took my statement and promised to patrol the area, but I knew I wouldn't feel safe for a long time. Even as I sat in my house, every creak and shadow made my heart race. That night I barely slept, my mind replaying the unsettling encounter over and over. Days later, I still found myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I walked down the street. The car never reappeared, but the memory lingered like a ghost, a constant reminder that some questions are better left unanswered. Story 2. I'm sitting at my desk at work, going over paperwork, when I hear a faint sound coming from the hallway. It's so subtle I can't be sure, but it sounds like someone is pacing back and forth just outside my office. I pause, setting my pen down, and strain my ears to listen. The sound stops, leaving an eerie silence in its place. Shaking my head, I try to focus back on the stack of reports in front of me. It's late, and I'm the only one left in the office. The quiet is normally a welcome companion, but tonight it feels oppressive. A part of me wonders if my mind is playing tricks on me. Minutes pass, and just as I'm about to immerse myself in work again, the sound returns. This time it's unmistakable, soft, deliberate footsteps moving up and down the hallway. My stomach tightens as I glance toward the door. It's closed, but the faint light seeping through the crack doesn't show any shadows. I tell myself it's probably the janitor making his rounds. Still, the pacing seems odd, as if whoever is out there has no real purpose. I rise from my chair, hesitating for a moment before heading to the door. My hand hovers over the doorknob as I take a deep breath and slowly pull it open. The hallway is empty. The fluorescent lights buzz faintly, casting long, sterile shadows along the tiled floor. I step out, peering both ways, but there's no sign of anyone. My pulse quickens as I stand there, trying to rationalize what I heard. Perhaps they've already moved on to another part of the building. Returning to my desk, I close the door firmly behind me and lock it for good measure. The feeling of unease doesn't leave, though. I can't shake the sense that something is off. The office feels different tonight, as if the familiar space has taken on an unfamiliar edge. I sit back down, but my focus is shattered. Every creak of the building, every hum of the air conditioning makes me jump. It's as if the usual background noise has become amplified, each sound conspiring to unsettle me further. I glance at the clock, wishing the night away. Just as I start to relax, the footsteps return. This time they're louder, more insistent, as if whoever is out there wants to be heard. My heart pounds as I stare at the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Could it be a coworker who forgot something? Or is it someone who doesn't belong here? I stand again, this time more cautious as I approach the door. My fingers tremble slightly as I unlock it and pull it open. The hallway stretches out before me, empty as before. I step out, my shoes barely making a sound on the floor. I decided to check the nearby offices. One by one, I push open doors and peek inside, finding nothing but dark, empty rooms. The building feels like a labyrinth, each turn leading to more silence and shadows. By the time I return to my own office, my nerves are frayed. I close and lock the door once more, leaning against it as I try to steady my breathing. Maybe I'm just overtired. Long hours in a quiet building can do strange things to the mind. Still, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. I sit down again, determined to finish my work and leave as soon as possible. The papers blur in front of me, my concentration broken by the persistent unease gnawing at me. Then, something new happens. A soft, almost imperceptible knock comes from the door behind me. I freeze, every muscle in my body tensing. The knock comes again, louder this time. I slowly turn my chair to face the door, my mind racing. I call out, asking who's there, but there's no response. The silence that follows is deafening. I'm torn between opening the door and staying put. My instincts scream at me to stay where I am, but curiosity gets the better of me. I rise, inching toward the door with cautious steps. My hand shakes as I unlock it and pull it open. Once again, the hallway is empty. This time, though, something is different. A faint trail of wet footprints leads away from my office, disappearing around the corner. The sight sends a chill down my spine. I haven't heard any rain, and the building's floors are always dry. I follow the footprints, my fear battling with a strange sense of compulsion. They lead me to the stairwell, where the heavy door is slightly ajar. I push it open, peering into the dimly lit stairwell. The footprints continue down the steps, fading as they go. A part of me wants to turn back, to lock myself in my office and wait until morning. But another part feels drawn to whatever is at the bottom of those stairs. I take a step, then another, the sound of my footsteps echoing eerily in the confined space. The air grows colder with each descent. When I reach the basement, the silence is suffocating. The faint hum of machinery does little to break the oppressive stillness. I scan the area, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The footprints end abruptly in the middle of the floor, as if whoever made them simply vanished. A sudden noise startles me, a faint scraping sound coming from one of the storage rooms. I turn toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. The door to the room is slightly open, a sliver of darkness beckoning me. I take a step closer, every instinct screaming at me to stop. I push the door open, revealing rows of shelves filled with old files and equipment. The room is empty, but the sense of being watched is overwhelming. I back away, my skin prickling with unease. As I turn to leave, I hear it again, the pacing, now directly above me. I race up the stairs, not stopping until I'm back in my office with the door locked firmly behind me. My hands tremble as I gather my things, determined to leave and not look back. As I step into the hallway one last time, I hear it again, the footsteps, following me as I make my way to the exit. I don't stop until I'm in my car, the engine roaring to life as I speed away from the building. Even then, the feeling of being watched lingers, the faint echo of footsteps haunting me long after I've left the office behind. Story 3. I sat at the bar, swirling the last sip of whiskey in my glass as I glanced at the door. My friend was running late, as usual, and I had nothing to do but wait. The low hum of conversation filled the room, punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses and laughter. I was about to check my phone again when I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I looked up and scanned the room, my eyes landing on a woman standing near the far wall. She was staring at me, her gaze unwavering. Her expression was unreadable, neither friendly nor hostile, but something about her intensity made my skin prickle. I quickly averted my eyes, trying to shake off the unease. When I glanced back a moment later, she was still looking at me. She hadn't moved an inch, her posture stiff and deliberate. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the TV above the bar, but the weight of her gaze was impossible to ignore. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, hoping she'd lose interest and look away. Minutes passed, and every time I dared to glance in her direction, she was still staring. She didn't blink, didn't fidget, didn't acknowledge anyone else in the room. It was as if the rest of the bar didn't exist to her. My unease deepened, and I started to feel a growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. I flagged down the bartender and ordered another drink, trying to focus on anything but her. When he handed me the glass, I leaned in slightly and asked if he knew who she was. He glanced over his shoulder, frowned, and shook his head. "Never seen her before," he said casually before moving on to another customer. The woman's presence was starting to feel oppressive. I debated whether I should leave and wait for my friend outside, but the idea of walking past her made my chest tighten. Instead, I decided to confront her, hoping that breaking the tension might put my mind at ease. I stood up, my legs feeling slightly unsteady, and made my way across the room. As I approached her, she didn't move or react. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, dark and unblinking. Up close, I noticed that her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her clothes looked outdated, like something from decades ago. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. "Can I help you with something?" I asked. She didn't answer. For a moment I thought she hadn't heard me, but then her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak. Instead, she turned abruptly and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened, before heading back to my seat. I glanced around the bar, half expecting her to reappear, but she was nowhere to be seen. The tension in my chest began to ease, and I took a long sip of my drink. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, or maybe she was just some eccentric person who liked to mess with strangers. Either way, I was glad she was gone. My relief was short-lived. As I stared down at my drink, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned my head slowly, and there she was, standing in the exact same spot as before, staring at me with that same unnerving intensity. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This time I didn't try to ignore her. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend, urging him to hurry. The thought of staying here alone any longer was unbearable. I kept my eyes on her, half expecting her to vanish again, but she stayed rooted in place, her gaze never wavering. A man at the bar noticed my distress and leaned over. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. I nodded quickly, not wanting to draw attention to the situation. "Just waiting for someone," I said, forcing a smile. He gave me a skeptical look, but didn't press further. When I looked back at the woman, she was gone again. My chest tightened, and I scanned the room frantically, but she was nowhere in sight. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Had she been real, or was my mind playing tricks on me? The room felt stifling, the air heavy and suffocating. Just as I was about to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from my friend. He was parking outside and would be in shortly. Relief washed over me, and I grabbed my jacket, ready to bolt as soon as he arrived. I glanced around the room one last time, hoping to see him walk through the door. Instead, I saw her again. She was standing just outside the bar's entrance, visible through the large front window. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me even from a distance. My hands trembled as I clutched my phone, willing my friend to hurry. The door opened, and my friend walked in, his usual carefree grin plastered on his face. "Sorry I'm late," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "What's up?" I turned to point out the woman, but when I looked back at the window, she was gone. I didn't tell him about her. As we ordered drinks and settled into a booth, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. But throughout the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching me from the shadows. And as we left the bar hours later, I couldn't resist one last glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see her face in the darkness. Story 4. I moved into a rundown apartment above a closed-down pawn shop. The rent was cheap, and I needed a place fast. The landlord didn't say much, just handed me the keys and told me not to worry about the shop downstairs. He said it had been shut for years, and there was nothing down there but dust. The first couple of nights were quiet. I settled in and got used to the creaks and groans of the old building. The pipes rattled sometimes, but that was normal for a place like this. I kept telling myself it was just an old structure, nothing more. But on the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of something faint. It was a soft scraping like metal on glass, coming from beneath the floorboards. I lay there for a while, listening closely, trying to figure out if it was just the pipes again. After a few minutes, it stopped, and I went back to sleep, thinking I was imagining things. The next night it happened again. I was reading in bed when I heard what sounded like a glass case sliding open. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone was being careful not to make noise. I froze, straining to hear more. There was a faint clink, like small objects being moved around. I told myself it had to be animals or something settling in the building, but the noises were too distinct. It wasn't the kind of random scurrying you'd expect from rats. It sounded like hands touching things, sorting through them carefully. By the end of the week, the noises became more frequent. Every night, around the same time, I'd hear the same routine. Glass opening, items shifting, soft thuds like things being set down on wood. Once, I swore I heard the faint click of a lock being turned. Curiosity got the better of me. The next morning, I went downstairs to look at the pawn shop. The front windows were covered in grime, but I could still see through them a little. Dust coated the shelves inside, and nothing looked out of place. The door was locked, and there was no sign anyone had been inside for years. I thought about calling the landlord, but what would I say? That I heard noises at night. He'd probably think I was just another tenant losing it in an old building. I decided to keep quiet and pay more attention at night instead. One evening I stayed awake, sitting in the dark, listening. Right around midnight it started again. A soft squeak as though a hinge was slowly moving. Then a faint sliding noise. It was clearer now, like I was getting used to hearing it. There was definitely something down there. I got up and pressed my ear to the floor. The sounds were louder that way. It was unmistakable someone was handling things beneath me. I heard a dull clinking, the kind you'd hear if coins or jewelry were being shifted around. I barely slept that night. The next day I tried the front door of the pawn shop again, but it was still locked. I even pushed on it a little, just to make sure. Nothing budged. I walked around the side, hoping to find a back entrance, but the alley was narrow and filled with old trash bins. The back door was sealed tight with a heavy chain. That night, I set an alarm for midnight. I sat on the floor again, ear pressed to the wood, waiting. Right on time. The noises started. They were slow, methodical. I could hear the familiar slide of glass, soft taps as things were picked up and set down. But this time, something different happened. There was a faint creak, like someone stepping on old floorboards. It was heavier than before, deliberate. I pulled away from the floor, heart pounding. For a second, I thought I heard breathing, slow and steady, but I told myself I was just imagining it. The next morning, I found something odd. Near my front door, on the floor, there was a small item. A tarnished silver locket, its chain broken. I picked it up carefully. It was old and cold to the touch, like it had been sitting in a dark place for a long time. I hadn't seen it there the night before. I set the locket on the counter and tried not to think about it. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept the lights on and stayed in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The sounds started again, but now they seemed closer. It wasn't just beneath the floor anymore. I heard something moving at the base of my apartment door. A soft scrape like nails or fingers lightly touching the wood. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else happened. I found another item the next morning. This time it was an old brass key lying next to the locket on the counter. I hadn't put it there. My hands shook as I picked it up. The key was heavy, cold, and old-fashioned. It looked like it belonged to an antique lock. That evening, I sat by the door, key in one hand, waiting. When the sound started again, I stood up slowly. I felt drawn to the noises now, like they wanted me to listen. There was no fear left, only a strange curiosity. At midnight, I unlocked my apartment door and stepped out into the hall. Everything was quiet for a moment. Then I heard it downstairs. A faint sound of something sliding shut. I walked down the steps carefully, each creak under my feet loud in the silence. I stood at the entrance to the pawn shop. The key in my hand felt warm now, like it had been waiting for me. Without thinking, I slid it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door opened with a soft groan. Inside, the air was heavy and cold. Dust hung in the beam of light from the street lamp outside. The glass cases stood there, empty and clean, not a speck of dust on them. I stepped further in, and the door slowly clicked shut behind me. Story 5. The trail I followed wasn't marked on any map. It twisted through dense pines and thick underbrush, leading deeper into a part of the forest I hadn't planned to explore. My original route had been clear and well-traveled, but something about this narrow path pulled at my curiosity. I kept walking, convincing myself I'd turn back soon. After an hour or so, the woods grew quiet in a way that made the air feel heavier. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. That was when I saw a house, almost hidden behind a thicket of trees. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the windows had been boarded up with warped, rotting planks. I stood there for a few minutes, staring. The house looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. But there was something strange about how the boards were nailed to the windows and door. They didn't look haphazard, like someone had tried to keep people out. It was more like they were meant to keep something in. My pulse quickened as I stepped closer. The wood creaked beneath my boots as I climbed onto what was left of the front porch. One of the boards covering the door hung loose at an angle. Without thinking much about it, I pulled it free and pushed the door open. The air inside was cold and smelled of damp wood and old dust. Light filtered through the gaps in the boards, casting thin slants across the floor. The place was silent, except for the soft sound of my breathing. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed the walls. At first, I thought it was old wallpaper peeling away, but when I stepped closer, I realized they were covered in sheets of paper. They had been nailed and tacked, layered one over the other until every inch of space was covered. Some were yellowed and brittle with age. Others were newer, the ink still sharp and dark. I reached out and touched one, feeling the roughness of the handwriting beneath my fingers. Each note was written by a different hand. Some were neat and careful, others scrawled in a rush. They all said different things, but there was one word that appeared in nearly every one: help. Some were single sentences begging for rescue, others were pages long, describing how they had found the house and couldn't leave. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I stepped back to take it all in, my eyes scanning the years scrawled on the bottom corners of many of the pages. The oldest one I could see was from 1921. The newest was dated only a few months ago. The thought crossed my mind to turn and leave right then. But something kept me there, as if the house had latched onto me the moment I'd stepped through the door. I moved slowly toward the stairs at the end of the hallway. They were steep and dark, and I hesitated before starting up. The second floor was no different. More notes covered the walls, but these were more frantic, the writing uneven and desperate. Some were written in what looked like dried brown smears instead of ink. My skin prickled at the sight of them. Whoever had written these had been here a long time, and they hadn't left. I tried to tell myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of prank or an art project. But the weight in the air told me otherwise. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, as if the house itself was holding its breath. There was a room at the end of the hallway with the door half open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. More papers, but these were torn and shredded, as if someone had tried to rip them down in a hurry. In the middle of the floor was a small pile of personal belongings: backpacks, boots, water bottles. They were coated in dust, but some of them looked almost new. I crouched and picked up a wallet. There was a driver's license inside, belonging to a man from a town not far from here. The expiration date was last year. My hand shook as I put it back. There was no sign of anyone else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood and backed out of the room, my heart pounding harder with each step. As I turned toward the stairs, I heard it. A soft scratching sound, faint but steady, coming from downstairs. It was followed by what sounded like a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, but my legs felt heavy. I made myself move, one slow step at a time, down the stairs and toward the front door. The scratching grew louder. I could hear the boards creaking under invisible footsteps that didn't belong to me. When I reached the door, I grabbed one of the loose boards and shoved it aside. I forced the door open and stumbled out onto the porch. The air outside was thin and sharp, but it felt cleaner, safer. I didn't stop to look back as I ran. The trees blurred past me as I pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the branches that clawed at my arms. I didn't know how long I ran before I saw the familiar trail again. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized the forest was silent again. I didn't tell anyone about the house when I made it back to town. I thought about it many times, but I knew if I told someone they might go looking for it, and some places are better left unfound. I still dream about the walls sometimes, though, covered in those desperate words, asking for help that never came. Story 6. I worked night security at an old mental hospital that had been shut down for over 2 decades. The place was massive, with endless hallways and cold, empty rooms. Most nights were quiet, just me and the hum of the cameras in the control room. Sometimes I would walk the floors to break the monotony, my flashlight sweeping over peeling paint and rusted equipment. The hospital had a history. Stories floated around about what happened to the patients before it closed, but I never paid them much attention. To me, it was just an old building, and I was here for a paycheck. Still, something about the silence always felt heavy, like the place was holding its breath. One night, near the end of my shift, I was doing a routine walkthrough of the West Wing. That part of the hospital had been locked up for years, doors chained and sealed after a partial collapse made it unsafe. Yet, as I walked past the entrance, I noticed the padlock on the double doors was missing. The heavy chain that had always hung there lay in a heap on the floor. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. No one had keys to that wing, not even me. I radioed into the control room, asking if anyone had been scheduled to do maintenance or inspections. The response was static at first, then silence. After a few more tries, the radio crackled to life, but there was no voice, just a faint, rhythmic clicking, like someone tapping a finger against the mic. My gut told me to call it in and leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the doors and stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was colder in there, damp and heavy with the smell of mildew. My boots echoed on the cracked tiles as I walked slowly, scanning each doorway I passed. About 50 feet in, I saw a faint glow coming from a room up ahead. It was soft and flickering, like candlelight. I approached slowly, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The door to the room was wide open, and what I saw inside made me stop cold. There was a circle of old wooden chairs arranged neatly in the center of the room. Each chair had a white tag tied to its back, names written in thick black marker. There were 13 chairs in total. As I stepped closer, I began reading the names aloud without thinking, my voice sounding strange in the quiet. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but one near the far side of the circle made my chest tighten. It was my name. Same spelling, middle initial, everything. I froze, the weight of the moment sinking in, and I took a step back without realizing it. The candles on the floor flickered as if stirred by a breeze, though the air was completely still. I scanned the room for any sign of someone else being there, but there was nothing. Just the chairs, the names, and the faint smell of smoke from the candles. I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move at first. Then I heard something, a faint creak, like weight settling on an old wooden chair. I turned toward the sound and saw one of the chairs slightly rocking back and forth. No one was there, but it kept moving slow and steady. The hair on the back of my neck rose, and I finally forced myself to turn toward the door. As I did, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow moved along the wall, but there was nothing that could have cast it. I didn't wait to see more. I hurried out of the room and down the hallway, my footsteps louder now as I nearly ran. When I reached the chain doors, they were closed again. The heavy chain was back in place, and the padlock was secured. My heart pounded as I stood there, trying to figure out how that was possible. My keys were in my pocket, untouched, and no one else had access to the building. I backed away from the doors and returned to the control room, checking the monitors. The feed for the West Wing was nothing but static. I rewound the footage, trying to see if it had been tampered with, but the video cut out about an hour before I had gone in. It made no sense, and no amount of reviewing the footage gave me answers. For the rest of my shift, I stayed in the control room, watching the screens even though most of them showed nothing. Every so often, I thought I heard faint whispers over the radio, but I told myself it was just interference. When my shift finally ended, I didn't wait around. I clocked out and left without looking back. The next night, I called in sick. Then I called in the night after that. Eventually, I quit the job altogether. I never told anyone about the chairs, the candles, or the names. I figured no one would believe me. Sometimes I think about going back to see if it was really there. But deep down, I know I won't. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some names shouldn't be written down. Story 7. I had heard about the old church on the outskirts of town, the one everyone said was cursed. Curiosity got the better of me one gray afternoon, and I packed my camera, determined to capture the decaying beauty of the place. The walk there was quiet, and the road leading to it was cracked and overgrown. When I finally saw the church, its steeple leaning at an odd angle, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The heavy wooden doors groaned when I pushed them open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rot, with sunlight filtering through the broken stained glass windows. Pews were scattered and broken, and old hymnals lay torn and forgotten on the floor. I took photos of the altar, the walls, and the crumbling ceiling, each shot capturing the weight of years left behind. Toward the back of the sanctuary, I noticed a narrow staircase that led downward. The air grew colder with each step I took, and my flashlight's beam flickered as if struggling to stay lit. At the bottom was a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar, revealing a room cloaked in darkness. I hesitated before stepping inside, my breath catching in my throat as I took in what lay before me. Old coffins were stacked along the damp stone walls, some sealed tight while others had rotted enough to reveal glimpses of what they once held. The wood was warped and cracked, and a foul odor lingered in the air. I counted 6 coffins in total, their surfaces covered in dust, but one stood out immediately. It was newer, the wood still clean with a metal latch that shone faintly in the dim light. I stepped closer, noticing something strange beneath it. The dirt underneath was darker, looser, as if it had been recently disturbed. I crouched down, brushing some of it away with my gloved hand, and the scent of fresh earth filled my nose. My chest tightened as I realized how out of place this was, how wrong it felt compared to the rest of the room. Standing up, I took a few cautious steps back, keeping my eyes on the newer coffin. The basement was silent except for my own breathing, which sounded loud in my ears. I lifted my camera again, taking a few pictures of the scene, though my hands were shaking now. The flash illuminated the room in harsh bursts, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the shadows. I told myself it was my imagination, that it was just nerves and darkness playing tricks. Still, the sense of being watched grew heavier with each second I lingered. I took another photo, this time of the ceiling, and noticed something strange in the corner of the frame. A figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the room. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. My flashlight beam darted across the walls and floor, searching for anything out of place. My breathing was shallow now, and I could feel a cold sweat on my neck. The figure hadn't been there, I told myself again. It was just a trick of the light, a shadow caught by the camera. Still, I needed to leave. My feet felt heavy as I backed toward the stairs, unwilling to turn my back on the room. The newer coffin remained where it was, silent and still, but the dirt beneath it seemed darker than before. I climbed the stairs quickly, half expecting something to grab my ankle as I went. Reaching the sanctuary again, I felt a brief sense of relief. The light seemed brighter here, and the air less oppressive, though it still carried the weight of abandonment. I made my way toward the doors, casting one last glance over my shoulder. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the shadows near the staircase, but when I blinked, it was gone. Outside, the gray afternoon had darkened further, and the wind had picked up, rustling through the dead leaves scattered across the ground. I hurried back down the cracked path, glancing back only once to see the church standing there, silent and cold. It wasn't until I got back to my car and locked the doors that I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my shaking hands. Later that night, I uploaded the photos to my computer, hoping to make sense of what I had seen. Most of them were what I expected, images of decay and abandonment, but a few made my skin crawl. In one, the newer coffin's lid appeared slightly open, though I was sure it had been closed when I left. In another, there were faint handprints in the fresh dirt. I told myself I was imagining things again, but deep down I knew I wasn't. Something had been down there with me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it watching even now as I sat safely at home. The feeling never left, not completely. I tried to forget about the church, to move on, but sleep came harder each night. Some nights I woke to the sound of faint scratching at my window, though no one was there when I looked. Once I found dirt on my bedroom floor, dark and loose, just like what I'd seen in the basement. I cleaned it up without thinking, but my hands were still shaking long after. I never went back to the church. I deleted the photos from my computer and my camera, but I don't think it mattered. Sometimes late at night I feel like something is still with me, watching, waiting, and I wonder if it followed me when I left that basement behind. Story 8. I arrived at the hunting lodge just as dusk settled over the dense forest. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and the long gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires as I pulled up. The building itself was old, built from thick logs darkened by years of harsh weather. It had an isolated, almost forgotten look. But it was exactly what I'd been hoping for, a quiet place to spend a weekend away. Inside, the lodge was rustic but clean. Heavy wooden beams crossed the ceiling, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall of the sitting room. There were 6 bedrooms in total, all lining a narrow hallway that seemed too quiet. The owner, a man named Elias, had given me the keys earlier that afternoon but said he wouldn't be staying the night. I wandered down the hall to choose a room, my footsteps muffled by an old runner rug that had seen better days. It was then I noticed something odd about the doors. Each one had a heavy-duty lock, not on the inside where you'd expect it, but on the outside. Thick bolts and sliding latches, too solid and deliberate to be decorative. Curious, I stepped closer to one of the doors and ran my fingers along the wood. Scratches marred the surface just below the handle. Long, uneven gouges that didn't look like they were made by furniture or careless hands. They looked desperate, like something had clawed at the door from inside. I checked the next room and found the same thing. Scratches, deep and ragged, as if fingernails or something sharper had scraped against the wood over and over. My stomach twisted as I stepped back. I reminded myself it was an old place. Maybe it had a history with wild animals getting inside. That made sense. It had to. I chose a room at the far end of the hall, one of the few without obvious marks. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, and inside was a simple bed with a faded quilt, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the trees. I set my things down and tested the lock from the inside, finding nothing but a standard latch. Only the exterior lock had any real strength. Night came quickly in the forest. The sky outside the window faded to black, and I could hear the wind picking up through the trees. I built a small fire in the stone hearth of the sitting room and sat for a while, listening to the crackle of the wood. Despite the oddness of the locks, I told myself there was nothing to worry about. When I finally went to bed, I double-checked the front door of the lodge, making sure it was bolted and secure. The hallway was cold as I made my way back to my room, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I closed the door behind me, but the lack of a lock on the inside suddenly made me feel exposed. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound the old lodge made. The wind outside, the occasional snap of wood settling, but then there was something else. A faint scraping noise, so quiet I almost convinced myself it wasn't there. I held my breath and listened. It came again, slower this time, like something was dragging across wood. It was coming from the hall. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to hear more. The noise stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, just outside my door. I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the door handle, watching it intently. But nothing happened. No turning of the knob, no pushing on the wood, just that awful, dragging sound. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room was freezing. I could see my breath in the faint moonlight coming through the window. I stayed sitting up for hours, waiting, but the noise didn't return. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I finally drifted into a restless sleep. I woke early. As the pale gray light of morning leaked through the window, my hands were stiff from gripping the blanket all night. Quietly, I got dressed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the sight made my chest tighten. New scratches ran across the wood outside my door, fresh and raw as if made just hours ago. I checked the other doors along the hall, my pulse racing. More scratches, deeper this time, and smears that looked like something darker stained the grain of the wood. I didn't want to know what it was. I grabbed my bag from the room and hurried down the hall. The sitting room was silent and still, but I felt watched. I locked the front door behind me, not sure why. My hands shook as I fumbled with the car keys. Once inside, I started the engine and drove without looking back, gravel flying beneath the tires. I called Elias later from town, asking him about the locks and the marks. He was quiet for a long time before saying it was just something old places like that had. He claimed it was for animals getting inside. His voice sounded hollow, as if he was repeating a line he'd practiced before. I didn't argue with him. I didn't mention the scratches outside my door that hadn't been there the night before. I just told him I wouldn't be coming back and ended the call. There are places people shouldn't stay, and that lodge was one of them. Story 9. The wind was sharp as I walked through the remnants of the forgotten mining town. Most of the buildings sagged under their own weight, roofs caved in, windows hollow and staring. Dust coated everything, muting the color of wood and stone. The air smelled of old rust and something faintly metallic. I made my way toward a structure that looked more intact than the others. A rusted sign hung loosely above the door, swaying with a soft creak. It was an old schoolhouse, its faded white paint peeling away in long strips. I stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath my boots. Inside, the air was still and heavy. Desks sat in crooked rows, some overturned, others half buried in dust. A chalkboard spanned one wall, the writing on it long smudged into ghostly shapes. On the teacher's desk, half hidden beneath a pile of yellowed papers, I found a small leather journal. Its cover was brittle, flaking away as I brushed off the dust. The pages inside were filled with tight handwriting, each letter pressed deep into the paper. I flipped through the first few pages, which spoke of daily lessons, the struggles of teaching children whose fathers worked in the mines. But as I read further, the entries became strange. The writer described people vanishing from their homes at night. They spoke of hearing muffled cries carried by the wind, and of waking to find empty beds and cold sheets. There was mention of strange figures seen standing at the edge of the town after sunset. No one could agree on who or what they were. One entry described how the townspeople held meetings in the church, arguing about whether to leave or stay. Some believed it was the earth taking back its own. Others whispered of something worse, something that had been unearthed deep in the mines. Fear seeped into every word as the entries went on. I kept reading, even as the light from the cloudy sky dimmed through the cracked windows. The entries became more frantic. The writer talked about hearing footsteps outside their door at night. They said they stopped answering knocks because no one was ever there when they opened it. The second to last entry mentioned the town was nearly empty now. The writer seemed unsure if they were the last one left. They spoke of hearing someone calling their name in a voice that wasn't quite right, stretched and hollow. They wrote they were going to stay awake through the night to listen. Then came the final entry. The handwriting was shaky, the lines uneven. They wrote they had heard footsteps again, but they were different this time. Slower, deliberate, stopping right outside their door. And then, finally, they wrote, "They sound like mine." I stared at the page, reading that last sentence again and again. My fingers trembled as I closed the journal. The schoolhouse seemed colder now, shadows creeping further across the floor. I could hear the wind outside, soft but steady, like someone breathing through their teeth. I stood and crossed the room, glancing out the broken window. The town was silent. The sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows across the dirt street. I suddenly felt the weight of the journal in my pack, heavier than it should have been. Leaving the schoolhouse, I walked quickly toward where I had parked. My boots crunched on the gravel, each step too loud in the quiet. Halfway there, I stopped. There was another sound behind me, soft, slow, almost matching my own. I turned sharply, scanning the empty street. There was nothing but the buildings leaning inward, as if listening. The wind picked up, swirling dust past my legs. I forced myself to keep moving, not looking back again. At the edge of town, near my car, the feeling grew stronger. That sense of being followed, watched. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and slid inside, slamming it shut behind me. My breathing was harsh in the small space, loud against the sudden silence. I started the engine, hands slick on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the buildings. A figure, still as stone, facing me. But when I looked back, the street was empty again. The drive away from the mining town was slow at first. Every turn of the wheels seemed to take an effort. The journal sat on the passenger seat, closed tightly, but I could feel something radiating from it. A presence, faint but there. Even miles from town, the feeling didn't leave me. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. I told myself it was just the story, the weight of old fear pressing into my mind, but I never opened the journal again. At home, I put the journal in a box and shoved it to the back of the closet. Some nights, I thought I could hear something shifting in there. Soft sounds, like pages turning. And sometimes, when I walked across my apartment, I thought I heard footsteps behind me perfectly matching my own. Story 10. I volunteered to help catalog an old library's collection in a neighboring town. The building was massive and silent, its wooden floors creaking with each step. Rows of dust-covered shelves stretched high above me, filled with books that hadn't been touched in years. The place had a certain heaviness, like the walls were holding their breath. Most of my work was simple, recording titles, authors, and publication dates. But on my third day, I found a thick, leather-bound book that didn't have a title on its spine. It was wedged tightly between two ledgers on a shelf far in the back. The leather was cold and stiff under my fingers as I pulled it free. Inside, the pages weren't printed like the others. Each page was handwritten, the ink faded but still legible. At first, I thought it was a record of library members because each page listed names, addresses, and dates next to them. But there was something odd. Some of the names were crossed out with dark, heavy strokes. I flipped through more pages, finding the same pattern. Some names had been cleanly crossed out, others left untouched. What unsettled me was how meticulously neat it all was. Each name, each address, written in careful script, as if it mattered greatly to whoever kept the list. At first, I assumed it was just an old membership ledger, but the addresses caught my eye. Many were street names I recognized from my own town. My curiosity deepened into unease. I took a photo of one of the pages with my phone, intending to look into it later. That night, unable to shake the feeling, I searched one of the names online. It belonged to an older man who had died 5 years earlier. His name in the book was crossed out. Another name belonged to a woman I saw regularly at the grocery store. Her name wasn't crossed out. I spent the next few days pretending everything was fine while I finished my hours at the library. But every night I sat at my computer, cross-referencing the names. The pattern became clear. The crossed-out names were people who had died. The ones still clean were alive and local. I thought about telling someone, but I didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't illegal to have a list of people's names, addresses, and dates. But something about it felt wrong, like I was looking at something I was never supposed to see. I started sleeping with my phone close, scrolling through the names whenever I woke in the middle of the night. On the 5th day, I noticed something new. There was a blank space at the bottom of the last page, and it wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I had stared at that empty part for a long time, wondering if more names would be added. When I returned the next morning, the blank space had a new name written in it. My stomach dropped as I read it. It was my name, my full name, written in that same neat handwriting, with my address and the date I first found the book. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back onto the shelf. My hands were shaking as I left the library without finishing my work. I told myself I was done volunteering. Whatever they wanted to catalog, they could do it without me. I blocked their number when they tried to call. But the next day, I found a piece of paper tucked under my apartment door. It had only my name and the date, the same one from the book. There was no message, no explanation. I locked every window and double-checked the door before sitting on my couch, staring at the paper for hours. At night, I barely slept. Every sound from the hallway made me sit up, listening. I left the lights on and kept my phone clutched in my hand. By the 3rd night, I was exhausted but too afraid to leave the apartment or call anyone. When I finally checked the book again, the next day was already crossed out. My name had a heavy black line through it. I didn't know what it meant. I was still alive, sitting there breathing, but the line was there, like some decision had already been made. I stopped going outside. I didn't answer calls or texts. I watched the street from my window, waiting to see if anyone came looking for me. Sometimes I thought I saw someone standing near the corner, watching my building. But when I blinked, they were gone. A week later, I heard someone knock at the door. I didn't move. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. I sat on the floor, back against the far wall, staring at the handle. It never turned. After a while, the knocking stopped. I don't know who made the list or why. I don't know how my name got on it or why it was crossed out. But I know I was supposed to leave it alone. I should have walked away from that book the moment I found it. Now I wait. I wait for something to happen because I know it will. I just don't know when. Story 11. I had always enjoyed photographing abandoned places. Old buildings with peeling paint, broken windows, and rusted metal told stories in a way nothing else could. When I heard about the old state prison just a few hours from where I lived, I decided it was the perfect place for my next project. The prison had been closed for decades, left to rot on the edge of town. The air was heavy as I stepped through the entrance gate. Everything smelled of damp concrete and rust. Chains hung loosely from walls, their links corroded over time. My footsteps echoed down the empty hallways as I explored cell block after cell block, each one darker than the last. I took my time, carefully framing shots of rusted bars and forgotten bunk beds. Some cells still had thin, rotted mattresses on metal frames. Others were stripped bare, the walls stained with old water damage. Every corner seemed to whisper a little piece of its history, and I found myself drawn deeper into the building. Eventually, I wandered into a wing that felt colder than the others. It wasn't the temperature so much as a feeling I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. The hallway was narrower here, and the cells smaller. I raised my camera and snapped a few pictures, but the atmosphere weighed heavy on my chest. One particular cell caught my eye. The door hung open on its hinges, swaying slightly as though someone had just walked out. I stepped inside, noting the deep scratches on the floor near the bed frame. The walls were covered in carvings, names, dates, drawings that didn't make much sense. I moved closer to one section of the wall and squinted. Among the chaotic etchings was something that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was my birth date, carved in careful, straight lines, the numbers still sharp despite the years. Below it was the name of the small town I had grown up in, a place hundreds of miles away. I stared at the carvings, my skin cold despite the warm light coming through the small barred window. There was no way this was coincidence. My town wasn't well known, just a quiet place few people ever left, let alone talked about. And yet here it was, carved into the wall of a prison cell far from home. My fingers traced the letters, the roughness of the stone biting at my skin. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe someone else had the same birthday. Maybe they were from the same town. But no name followed, no indication of who had made the carvings. Just the date and the town. It felt like a message. I stepped back and looked around the cell again. The bed frame was bolted to the wall, its paint flaking away in curls. An old blanket lay in a heap on the floor, torn and stiff with age. I noticed something sticking out from under the mattress and pulled it free. It was a notebook, the pages brittle and yellow. The cover was blank, except for a series of small cuts in the leather, almost like tally marks. I opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with cramped handwriting. Most of it was nonsense lists of numbers, random words, phrases repeated over and over again. One page near the middle caught my eye. It had my birth date written at the top, followed by a sentence that made my stomach twist. The one who finds this knows the way out. I read it 3 times, my hands trembling more each time. What was this supposed to mean? The rest of the page was filled with more writing, but it was almost impossible to read. The letters overlapped, smudged by time and moisture. I closed the notebook and slipped it into my bag. I didn't know why I felt the need to keep it, but something told me to. As I left the cell, I glanced back at the carvings on the wall. A sliver of sunlight hit the stone just right, making the letters seem fresher somehow. I hurried down the hallway, the sound of my boots slapping against the concrete louder than before. It felt like something was following me, though every time I turned around, the hallway was empty. I made it back to the main entrance and pushed the heavy door open. The afternoon sun was blinding after the dim light inside. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The prison loomed behind me, silent and empty, but it didn't feel abandoned anymore. Driving home, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Nothing was there, just the road stretching out behind me. Still, I drove faster than usual, wanting to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. The notebook sat on the passenger seat, its worn leather cover dark against the faded upholstery. That night, I spread the notebook pages out on my kitchen table, trying to make sense of them. The handwriting was tight and frantic, but certain words appeared again and again. Home, return, watch, It was as if whoever wrote them had been trying to send a message, but I didn't know who they were or why it mattered to me. Days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about that cell. I kept dreaming about it, the carvings on the wall glowing faintly in the dark. Sometimes I saw a figure sitting on the bunk staring at me without moving. Other times I heard my name being whispered, but I couldn't find where it was coming from. I finally decided not to go back to the prison, but it was too late. Wherever I went, I felt like I was being followed. At home, lights flickered when I walked by, shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't. And sometimes, late at night, I would wait to find the notebook lying open on my bed, turn to the page with my birth date and my hometown. The writing seemed fresher each time. Story 12. The boarding house had a quiet charm to it when I first arrived. It was one of those old historic homes converted into rooms for rent, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings. The woman who managed it told me it had been standing since the early 1900s, and still had most of its original fixtures. I liked that about it, and the rent was cheap enough to make me overlook how drafty it felt even on warm days. My room was on the second floor, at the very end of the hall. It was small but cozy, with a tall window that looked out over the side yard and a heavy oak door that locked with an old-fashioned key. I settled in easily, unpacking my things and setting up a little desk by the window. The first few days passed quietly, with nothing more unsettling than the groan of the house settling in the middle of the night. Then, on my fourth night there, something strange happened. I woke up for no reason and glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It read 2:13 a.m. A second later, I heard it. The soft rattle of my doorknob being jiggled, as if someone was testing the lock from the other side. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in the dark. The sound went on for about 10 seconds before stopping completely. I got out of bed and crossed the room, pressing my ear against the door. There was nothing on the other side. I stood there for a while longer, holding my breath, but the hallway remained silent. The next morning, I chalked it up to one of the other tenants maybe getting confused about which room was theirs. The house had 6 other people living in it, and it wasn't impossible that someone had made a mistake in the dark. Still, I mentioned it to Mrs. Holloway, the landlady, when I saw her in the kitchen. She smiled politely but said no one else had mentioned anything odd. That night, I locked my door and wedged a chair under the knob, just in case. I left the light on and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. But sure enough, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the sound came again. The jiggling of the knob, deliberate and steady, as if whoever was doing it was in no rush. I froze, staring at the door from my bed. The chair under the knob didn't move, and the door held firm, but the sound didn't stop for a long time. When it finally did, I stayed awake until the first light of dawn came through the window. I got up then and moved the chair away to check the hallway. It was empty, completely still and quiet. On the 5th night, I was too wired to sleep at all. I sat in bed with the lights on, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. When 2:13 came, I was already on edge, watching the door. The knob jiggled again, slow and steady as if following some rhythm. But this time, when I got out of bed and approached, the sound stopped abruptly. I pulled the door open in one quick motion, expecting to catch someone there. The hallway was empty, but something else caught my eye. On the carpet just outside my door, there were fresh, muddy footprints. They trailed off down the hall, each one distinct, as if someone had just walked through wet dirt and then paced back and forth in front of my room. I stared at them for a long time before stepping back and shutting the door again. Sleep was impossible after that. The next morning I asked Mrs. Holloway if anyone had come in late during the night, but she just gave me the same polite smile and said everyone had been in their rooms. She even mentioned that no one used the back garden lately, where the mud might have come from. The footprints were gone by the time I checked again that afternoon. The carpet looked freshly vacuumed, and there was no sign they'd ever been there. I considered moving out, but I had paid for the month, and there wasn't really anywhere else I could afford to go. Instead, I tried to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. The nights that followed were worse. Every night at the exact same time, the doorknob rattled. Every morning I found those muddy footprints in the hall. Sometimes they were faint, but they were always there. And no matter how many times I asked, Mrs. Holloway acted as though nothing strange was happening. After a week, I stopped sleeping altogether. I spent my days exhausted, barely functioning at work. I thought about setting up a camera, but the house was old, and there weren't any outlets near the door. I even considered sitting up all night and waiting to open the door again, but something inside me was too afraid. Then one night, something changed. The jiggling stopped suddenly, and instead of silence, I heard slow breathing just outside the door. Deep, labored breaths, like someone standing close enough to press their face against the wood. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the door and waiting for the sound to go away. It didn't. The breathing went on for minutes, maybe longer, before fading. The next morning I found the footprints again, but this time they led from my door to the staircase and down. I followed them, my stomach tight, until they disappeared at the bottom of the steps. There was no mud outside that I could see. I moved out the next day, packing up what little I had and leaving half my things behind. Mrs. Holloway didn't ask why. She just smiled that same polite smile and handed me back my security deposit in cash. I never went back, and I never found out who or what had been at my door every night. But sometimes, even now, I wake up at exactly 2:13 a.m., and for a moment, I think I can hear that slow breathing just outside my door. Story 13. I worked maintenance at an old theater downtown. The place had been around since the 1920s, and had changed hands a dozen times over the years. Most of the time it sat quiet, only hosting the occasional play or film screening. My job was simple: keep the lights working, mop the floors, and make sure the building was safe to use. The days were easy enough, but I dreaded the nights. That place took on a different feeling once everyone was gone. The seats in the dark auditorium looked like rows of silent figures, and the old pipes groaned and clattered like footsteps when no one was there. Still, it was work, and I was used to being on my own. One night I was finishing up my shift later than usual. There had been a leak backstage, and it took me longer than I expected to fix it. I was about to lock up when I noticed something strange. Behind the heavy curtains at the back of the stage, there was a draft cold air slipping through a gap I had never noticed before. I pulled the curtain back and found a small door, almost hidden in the wall. It was old, the paint cracked and peeling, and the handle was rusted. I had worked there for over a year and never once noticed it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tried the handle. It creaked open on stiff hinges. Inside was a narrow room. The air smelled stale, like old wood and dust. There was a thin mattress on the floor, along with a blanket that looked recently used. In the corner, an old crate served as a makeshift table. On it were several items: an empty water bottle, a candle burned down to a stub, and a stack of photographs. I stepped closer and picked up the photos, flipping through them slowly. My stomach twisted as I realized what I was looking at. They were pictures of me. In each one, I was locking up the theater, turning off lights, and walking across the empty stage. One of them was taken from behind me as I stood at the front entrance, keys in hand. My first thought was that someone was playing a sick joke. I looked around the room again, but there was no sign of anyone there now. The mattress was cold to the touch, but the dust around it had been disturbed, and there were fresh footprints on the wooden floor leading out to the stage. I backed out of the room and shut the door. My heart was racing, but I told myself I needed to stay calm. I checked every exit in the theater, making sure each one was still locked. Nothing had been broken into, and none of the doors showed signs of being forced. For the rest of the night, I sat in the lobby with all the lights on, waiting for my shift to end. I kept glancing at the stage, half expecting to see someone move behind the curtain. When morning finally came, I locked up and left without finishing my rounds. The next day, I told myself it was probably a homeless person looking for shelter. Maybe they found a way and I hadn't noticed. I decided to check the room again, just to be sure. When I opened the little door, everything inside was gone. The mattress, the crate, the photos, all of it had vanished. I searched the rest of the theater, but found nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every creak of the old building made me flinch, and I started carrying a flashlight everywhere, even during the day. A week passed without anything strange happening. I convinced myself that whoever had been staying there had moved on. Maybe they realized I'd found their space and decided to leave before I called anyone. But one night, when I was cleaning the balcony seating, I found something else. It was another photograph, tucked under one of the seats. This time it showed me standing on the stage, taken from above, as if someone had been watching from the balcony while I worked. I hadn't seen anyone there that night. I hadn't heard anything, either. After that, I started hearing noises behind the walls. Scraping sounds like someone dragging something heavy along the floor. Sometimes I'd hear faint breathing or whispers I couldn't quite make out. I searched again and again, but never found anyone. I stopped working nights whenever I could help it. If I had to close up, I rushed through it, locking up as fast as I could. But no matter how quickly I left, I still felt those eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the dark. One evening, a coworker found another photo taped to the mirror in the men's restroom. It was a picture of me unlocking the side entrance, my face turned toward the camera, eyes wide like I'd just seen something. But I had no memory of that moment. I didn't remember anyone taking a picture. I didn't even remember feeling afraid at the time. Eventually, I quit the job. I told myself I needed something less creepy, something that didn't keep me awake at night. The theater still stands there, but I haven't been back since. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has found that little door behind the stage, or if someone else is sleeping there now. At night, I still lock all the windows in my apartment and check every closet before bed. But sometimes, when I'm walking home, I get the feeling someone is following me. Once I thought I saw a camera flash behind me in a reflection, but when I turned around, the street was empty. Still, I walked a little faster after that. Story 14. The house had been sitting at the edge of town for years, crumbling and forgotten. People said it wasn't safe, but curiosity pulled at me every time I passed it. One afternoon, with the sky overcast and the streets quiet, I decided to take a closer look. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, and I pushed it open without much effort. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew. The wooden floor creaked under my feet as I stepped into what used to be the living room. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, and broken furniture was scattered around. In the center of the room, a stained mattress lay directly on the floor, sunken in places where the stuffing had given out. At first, I thought it was strange but harmless. Then I noticed the chains. They were bolted directly into the wall, thick iron links, rusted but still solid. I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure out why they were there. They weren't the kind used for decoration or hanging anything useful. The metal cuffs attached to the chains made it worse. They were open, as if someone had once been held there but was now gone. A shiver ran through me despite the warmth of the afternoon. I backed away slowly, feeling an urgent need to leave the place behind. As I turned to go, I noticed the front door. It was closed. I knew I had left it wide open when I came in. My heart jumped, and I walked quickly toward it, but when I grabbed the knob and twisted, it didn't move. The door was stuck, as if it had swollen in the frame or someone had locked it from the outside. I told myself it was old and probably just jammed. I pulled harder, then threw my shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. The house groaned softly around me, like it was settling deeper into the ground, but it made me feel like I wasn't alone. I moved back through the living room, looking for another exit. There was a hallway leading to the back, and I followed it carefully. The walls were covered in dark smudges that might have been mold or something worse. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the emptiness. At the end of the hall, I found a kitchen. The counters were bare, the cabinets hanging open and empty. There was a back door, but it was the same as the front. Closed tight, the handle unyielding. I tried the windows, but they were nailed shut, the boards outside covering them entirely. I felt something then. A shift in the air, a faint breath of cold that didn't belong. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. I went back toward the living room, thinking about breaking a window if I had to. As I passed by the hallway again, I heard a faint noise. It was soft but distinct, like metal scraping against metal. It came from the room with the mattress and chains. I froze for a moment, then forced myself to look. The chains were swinging gently now, as if they had just been touched. The cuffs clinked together once softly, then stopped. I stared at them, feeling my breath catch in my throat. I hadn't touched them. Nothing should have moved. I backed away again, feeling panic rising. I needed to get out no matter what. I picked up a broken chair leg from the corner and smashed it against the nearest window. The glass cracked but didn't shatter, the old panes holding together. I hit it again, harder this time, and finally the glass gave way. I cleared the edges with my sleeve and climbed through, cutting my hand on a sharp point. The boards outside weren't as solid as they looked, and I pushed them aside enough to squeeze out. I landed hard on the ground outside, scraping my knees, but I didn't care. I stood up and ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, panting and clutching my bleeding hand. When I finally turned around, the house looked the same as it always had. Quiet, broken, and still. But I knew what I had seen inside. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those chains swaying. I kept thinking about who might have been there before me and why the door had closed on its own. The house hadn't wanted me to leave. That was what stayed with me most. In the morning, I told myself I wasn't going back, but part of me needed to know more. I searched old records at the library, trying to find out who had owned the place. There wasn't much. It had been abandoned for decades, the last owner gone without a trace. Some people said it had been a boarding house. Others whispered about things that happened in the basement. I didn't want to hear more. I already knew enough. The chains on the wall had told me everything I needed. I stayed away after that. I avoided that street, crossed to the other side if I was anywhere near. But sometimes at night I thought I heard the faint sound of metal clinking together. and when I looked out my window, I could just barely see the outline of that house in the distance, waiting. Story 15. The old mill had been abandoned for years, but it stood between where I was and where I needed to be. I figured taking a shortcut through it would save me time. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the broken path that led to the building. I told myself there was nothing to worry about. The place was silent when I stepped inside, except for the faint groan of old wood settling under its own weight. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred up by my footsteps. The beams above were riddled with gaps where daylight slipped through, thin and pale. I kept walking, boots crunching softly against the littered floor. I passed rusted machinery and piles of rotting wood. Most of the windows were fogged with grime and dust, but something on one of them caught my eye. Scrawled into the dirt on the glass were 3 words: "I see you." For a second, I thought maybe it had always been there. Maybe some bored kid had written it years ago. I wiped it clean with the sleeve of my jacket and moved on, telling myself not to think about it. The sound of my breathing was louder now, echoing faintly in the empty space. As I moved deeper into the mill, I tried to stay focused on the far door. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting my skin. Another window came into view, its glass cracked down the center. My stomach dropped when I saw it again. Those same words: "I see you." The letters were clearer this time, as if they had just been written. I hesitated, staring at it. The dust around the message was undisturbed, smooth except for the words carved through it. I didn't wipe this one away. I just turned and kept moving, walking faster now. My steps echoed louder than before, making it sound like someone else was following me. The far end of the mill wasn't much farther. I told myself that if I could just reach the exit, I'd be fine. Then I saw another window, lower to the ground, with the message again. This time the letters were bigger, darker in the fading light. "I see you." The sight of it made my chest tighten. I glanced over my shoulder. The space behind me was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was close. I moved faster, nearly running now, my boots slipping slightly on the dusty boards. The sound of my steps was joined by something else, a soft shuffle, deliberate, just behind me. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The sound stopped too. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, but the silence stretched on too long. I forced myself to take another step, and the shuffle started again. Closer this time. Panic built in my chest. I broke into a run, heading straight for the far door. The wood creaked loudly beneath me, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be out. As I reached the door, I grabbed the rusted handle and pulled. It didn't budge. I yanked again, harder this time. The door groaned but held fast, as if something on the other side was keeping it shut. My heart pounded in my ears. I turned and pressed my back to the door, trying to catch my breath. That was when I noticed the writing on the wall beside me. The words were there again. "I see you." This time they were traced into the dust on the wall itself, long uneven letters scratched deep. I pushed away from the door, searching for another way out. There was a stairway leading up to the second level. Without thinking, I bolted for it. The stairs groaned under my weight, but they held. I reached the upper floor and found more machinery, all rusted and still. The windows up here were larger, most of them broken. I moved toward one, hoping I could climb through. But on the glass, half shattered and streaked with grime, the message appeared again. "I see you." I felt like the words were watching me, following me, repeating themselves no matter where I turned. My hands trembled as I tried to push a broken frame aside to make room to climb through. The metal sliced my palm, but I barely felt it. I hauled myself up and over, landing hard on the roof of a lower section of the building. I didn't stop to check the damage. I ran across the rooftop, boards shifting and groaning beneath me. Ahead was another section of roof, and beyond that, the tree line. I just had to make it there. I glanced back once and saw nothing behind me, but I still felt the weight of eyes. I made it to the edge of the roof and jumped down to the ground. My legs screamed from the impact, but I kept moving. The woods were thick, and the light was fading fast. I didn't look back again. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until the mill was far behind me. When I finally stopped, bent over and gasping for air, I realized my hands were still shaking. I turned in a slow circle, half expecting to see those words somewhere nearby, scratched into the bark of a tree or traced in the dirt. But there was nothing. I never took that shortcut again. The mill still stands out there, sagging and silent. People say it's empty, that there's nothing inside but old machines and dust. I know better. I still think about those words, written again and again. I see you. Sometimes I wonder if something is still watching. Story 16. My uncle's hunting cabin had been sitting empty for years. After he passed, no one in the family had much reason to go out there. It was deep in the woods, a couple hours from the nearest town, and wasn't easy to get to. But something about that isolation made me want to see it for myself, just once. I made the trip in early fall, when the leaves were starting to turn and the air carried a sharp chill. The dirt road leading to the cabin was overgrown, and I had to park halfway up and walk the rest of the way. The place looked as abandoned as I expected. The wood siding was gray with age, and the windows were dusty and cracked. When I stepped up to the front door, I expected it to be stuck or swollen from years of neglect, but it opened smoothly without a sound. That gave me pause. I stood there for a second, listening for anything inside, but it was quiet. I convinced myself that maybe someone in the family had come by recently, even though no one mentioned it. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold. Dust covered most surfaces and cobwebs hung in the corners of the ceiling. I walked through slowly, half expecting something to jump out at me, even though I knew how ridiculous that was. Then I noticed the smell of smoke. Not old smoke, but fresh, faint, like a fire that had just been put out. I followed the scent to the fireplace in the main room. The stone hearth was still warm when I placed my hand near it. Ashes in the grate glowed faintly, the fire having died down not long before I got there. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. No one was supposed to be here. There was no sound of movement, no creak of floorboards from someone in the other rooms. I stood there in silence, the weight of the empty cabin pressing in on me. On the small table near the fireplace there was a notebook. Its black cover was cracked, the edges frayed. I picked it up, hoping maybe it was something my uncle had left behind. The first few pages were full of dates and times. Then I noticed names. My family's names. My mother, my brother, my cousins, even me. Each name had details next to it, describing where we went, who we spoke to, and what times we left our homes. It was exact, almost obsessive. My throat tightened as I turned the pages. The entries got more recent. They described what my brother wore 2 days ago, what time my mom picked up groceries the week before. The most recent entry was that morning. It said I left my house at 7:30, heading north. It noted what I packed in the car and the exact time I arrived at the turnoff to the cabin's road. I set the notebook down carefully, my hands cold despite the heat still coming from the hearth. I tried to tell myself there was some explanation. Maybe someone in the family had been keeping tabs on everyone. though that thought wasn't much comfort. But none of them should have known I decided to come here today. I hadn't told anyone. I walked through the rest of the cabin, checking each room. The small kitchen was dusty but showed signs of recent use. The sink was wet, as if someone had just rinsed something in it. There was a single mug sitting on the counter, the inside stained with fresh coffee. The back door was locked from the inside, but the key was still in the lock, turned as if someone had just left it there. I stood in the middle of the cabin, feeling watched even though I couldn't see anyone. The trees outside swayed gently in the breeze, the branches tapping against the roof. I looked out every window, but the woods were still. No movement, no sound other than the leaves. A part of me wanted to leave immediately, but something made me linger. I opened the small closet near the door, half expecting to find more notebooks or something worse. There were coats hanging neatly on old wooden hangers, but one of them wasn't dusty. It was a dark jacket, newer than the others, with a cell phone in the pocket. The battery was dead, but I recognized the model. It was the same kind my cousin had. I put the phone back and closed the closet. My hands were shaking by then, and I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed the notebook from the table and stuffed it into my backpack. I wasn't leaving it behind for whoever had been here to pick up later. I walked outside, locking the front door behind me more out of habit than anything else. The trail back to my car felt longer than before, and every snap of a twig made me whip around, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was no one there. When I finally made it back to the car, I got inside and locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath and listening. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. I started the engine and drove back toward town without stopping. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the notebook and what was written in it. I flipped through the pages again, reading the notes about my family's routines. The last page had something new written on it, something I hadn't seen earlier. It simply said, "Watched him find the book. He's taking it home." Story 17. The old barn had been sitting empty for years, tucked away behind a house that hadn't been lived in since I was a kid. My uncle had recently bought the place with plans to restore the property, and I agreed to help him clean it out one weekend. The air smelled thick with dust and mildew as we pried open the heavy wooden doors. Sunlight spilled through the gaps in the walls, catching on floating dust, illuminating broken tools and rusted farm equipment. Most of the barn was what I expected: old hay bales stacked in the corner, a few rusted-out wheelbarrows, and piles of boards that looked like they'd collapse if you breathed too hard on them. We worked our way through the clutter, tossing anything too rotten or broken into a growing pile by the doors. The deeper we went, the quieter it felt, as if the barn was holding its breath. My uncle joked that it was probably full of raccoons, but I wasn't so sure. Toward the back of the barn, there was a row of horse stalls, the wood gray and splintering with age. Most of the stall doors hung crooked on their hinges, swinging open easily when pushed. But one was different. The door was solid, reinforced with extra boards nailed across it, and a heavy padlock hung from a metal latch. My uncle tried the lock, but it wouldn't budge. He shrugged and said we could just leave it for now, but something about that door stuck with me. After he stepped outside for a smoke break, I grabbed an old crowbar I'd seen leaning against the wall and went back to the stall. It took more force than I expected, but eventually, the wood around the latch cracked enough for me to pull the door open. Inside it was dark and cold, the smell of old wood replaced by something sharper, something sour. I shined my flashlight around the space and felt my stomach twist. Dozens of pieces of paper were tacked to the walls, each one carefully pinned, covering the wood almost entirely. I stepped closer and realized they weren't old farm records or feed receipts. They were missing person flyers. They looked worn and yellowed, the corners curling and stained. Some of them were so faded I could barely make out the faces. Others were newer, their images sharp and clear under the plastic sleeves someone had used to protect them. I counted them without meaning to 37 in total, maybe more, each showing a different face, a different name, a different place where someone had vanished. My chest tightened as I backed out of the stall, nearly tripping over an old feed bucket in the process. I stared at the door for a few seconds, wondering who had locked it in the first place. The lock had been new, the metal barely rusted, and the boards nailed across the door hadn't looked as old as the rest of the barn. I called for my uncle, but he didn't answer. I stepped outside and found him standing by his truck, talking on the phone. When I told him what I found, he frowned and followed me back to the stall. He stood there for a long time, his mouth a tight line as he took in the flyers. I asked him if he knew anything about the last owners of the property, but he just shook his head. We called the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy out an hour later, a quiet man who didn't seem surprised by what we showed him. He took photos, asked a few questions, and then said someone else would be by to collect the evidence. My uncle and I stood by the barn doors after he left, neither of us saying much. The sun was starting to set, and the barn looked darker now, heavier, like it was holding something back. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the faces on those flyers, about how some of them had looked like they'd been posted recently. I wondered who had brought them there and why. My mind wouldn't stop running through possibilities, none of them good. The next day, I went back to the barn alone. My uncle had business in town, but I couldn't stay away. The stall was empty now, the flyers all gone, but something about the space still felt wrong. I noticed scratches on the inside of the door, long gouges in the wood about waist height. They weren't old scratches either. I followed the scratches down to the floor, where the dirt was loose and dark. It looked like it had been disturbed recently, so I grabbed a shovel and started digging. About a foot down, I found bones. They were old, brittle, and scattered like they'd been dumped there in a hurry. I stopped digging after that, my hands shaking too much to hold the shovel. The sheriff came back that afternoon, this time with more deputies and a crime scene team. They closed off the barn and told us not to go near it. My uncle didn't argue. He said he was thinking about selling the place, that it wasn't worth the trouble anymore. I agreed with him, but part of me still wanted answers. A few weeks later, I read in the paper that they'd found more remains in the barn and that the investigation was ongoing. They never said who was responsible or if they had any suspects. Some nights, I drive past the property, watching the barn from the road. The lights are always on now, casting long shadows through the cracks in the walls. I don't stop anymore. I don't think I ever will again. Something happened in that barn, something that went on for years, and whoever was behind it might still be out there. Story 18. The old motel sat on the edge of town, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. I had driven past it 100 times, but never paid it much attention until that afternoon. Something about it called to me, a quiet pull I couldn't explain. I parked my car in the cracked lot and stepped out, the air thick with dust and silence. The office door hung open on rusted hinges. Inside, there was an old desk with papers scattered everywhere, as if someone had left in a hurry. A dusty bell sat on the counter, but I didn't bother trying it. The place was clearly abandoned, yet something told me it hadn't been empty for long. I walked past the office and down the row of rooms. Most of the doors hung open, revealing spaces stripped of furniture and color. Old mattresses leaned against the walls and broken lamps lay in corners. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. At the end of the row was one door that was shut tight. Room 9. Unlike the others, the handle wasn't rusted, and the door frame looked recently painted. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to try it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I turned the knob. It opened smoothly, almost welcoming. Inside, the room was clean. Too clean. The bed was made neatly, sheets tied at the corners, and a single chair sat in the corner. Against the far wall was a tall shelving unit packed with tapes, each one labeled carefully in black marker. Every tape had a room number and a date. I scanned the rows, my breath catching when I saw today's date scribbled on one of them. A cold weight settled in my stomach. The tape was marked Room 9. I glanced toward the bed, then noticed the cameras. 2 of them were aimed directly at it, mounted on cheap tripods. Their lenses glinted in the dim light, focused and silent. The little red lights told me they were still recording. I took a step back toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. Something about the room felt wrong, like I was being watched even beyond the cameras. I reached out to switch one off, but stopped myself. If someone was still watching the feed, they'd know I was there. Instead, I moved to the shelf and picked up the tape with today's date. It was warm to the touch, like it had been handled recently. I slid it into my backpack without thinking, hands shaking slightly. There were other tapes too, going back months, maybe years. Room numbers repeated often. Some of them had dates scratched out and rewritten. The air felt heavier with each passing second. I needed to leave, but something kept me standing there. On the dresser there was a notebook. Its cover was torn and pages stuck out at odd angles. I flipped it open with careful fingers, revealing lists of names, dates, and room numbers. Some had check marks beside them. Others were crossed out violently. I recognized one of the names. It was someone who had gone missing months ago. Their picture had been on flyers all over town. Now their name was scrawled in this book, marked with a check. My chest tightened as I realized what this place was. It wasn't just an old motel. It was a hunting ground. The floor creaked behind me. I froze, afraid to breathe. Slowly I turned my head. The door was closing, but no one was there. My pulse pounded in my temples as I rushed toward it, grabbing the handle and yanking it open. The hallway was empty, but I knew better than to think I was alone. I moved quickly down the hall toward the lot, trying not to run but failing miserably. The sound of my footsteps echoed against the crumbling walls. As I neared my car, I noticed something that made me stop cold. The camera from Room 9 was now mounted on the hood of my car, still recording. I yanked it off and smashed it to the ground, my hands trembling. There were fresh footprints in the dust near my driver's door, too large to be mine. I scrambled into the car, locking the doors immediately. The key shook in the ignition as I tried to start it. The engine turned over on the third try. Gravel sprayed as I sped out of the lot, leaving the motel behind me. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the driveway. They didn't move. They just watched as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached town. I parked behind a gas station, hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The tape was still in my backpack, heavy and accusing. Part of me wanted to throw it away, but I knew I couldn't. Someone needed to see it. At home, I locked every door and closed every curtain. I found an old VCR in the garage, and set it up in the living room. My fingers hesitated over the tape before I finally slid it in. Static filled the screen before the image cleared. It was room 9. The camera feed showed the bed, perfectly made, then me standing there. I watched myself look at the tapes, pick one up and put it in my bag. But there was something else. A shadow moved in the corner of the frame just behind me. I hadn't noticed it at the time. The figure stepped closer in the video, its face hidden behind a blank mask. I hit stop, ejecting the tape with shaking hands. Someone had been in there with me the entire time. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, but it didn't feel like enough. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made me jump. Morning came slowly, dragging its feet, and when it did, I found another tape sitting on my doorstep. It was marked with today's date and my address. Story 19. The house was a mess when we first saw it. Peeling paint, broken windows, and overgrown weeds made it look worse than it was. My friend Tom had bought it for cheap, hoping to fix it up and flip it. He asked if I wanted to help him with the work, and I figured it might be a good way to spend the weekends. We started upstairs, tearing out old carpet and scraping wallpaper that had fused itself to the walls. The place smelled like damp wood and mold, but we worked through it. After a while, it started to look a little better. We joked about what we'd find next, figuring there might be old coins or newspapers left behind. One afternoon, Tom decided we should finally tackle the basement. We hadn't gone down there yet, partly because the door had been stuck, and partly because we kept finding excuses to avoid it. When we finally forced the door open, a blast of cold air hit us. The stairs creaked with every step as we descended, flashlights cutting through the dark. The basement was unfinished, with stone walls and a cracked cement floor. It was bigger than we expected, with old shelves lining one side and rusty tools scattered in the dust. We were clearing out junk when Tom noticed something strange on one of the walls. A section of brick stood out, newer and less weathered than the rest. We both stared at it for a minute, then started tapping on the bricks. It gave off a hollow sound, different from the solid walls around them. Without saying anything, Tom went to get the sledgehammer. It took longer than we thought, but eventually we broke through. Behind the wall was a small room, maybe 8 feet by 8. It was completely bare except for a single wooden chair bolted to the center of the floor. A heavy iron chain hung from the wall, ending in a rusted cuff. Scratches covered the cement around the chair, deep grooves etched in desperate, random patterns. For a while we just stood there, staring. Tom was the first to move, stepping inside slowly while keeping his flashlight aimed at the chain. He reached out and ran his hand along the wall. The scratches were on the concrete too, not just the floor. Some were low, others much higher, as if someone had been clawing at the walls. The chair was old but solid. Thick legs, the wood stained dark from years of use. The chain was bolted into the wall with a heavy plate, and the cuff at the end was large enough for a wrist or an ankle. It looked old, but not ancient. Someone had used this within the last few decades. I didn't want to be in that room. Something about it made my skin crawl, like we'd stepped into a space that didn't want us there. Tom kept looking around, shining his light into the corners, searching for something. He didn't say anything for a long time. Eventually we backed out and sat on the basement stairs. Tom was pale, his hands resting on his knees. He said he hadn't known anything about this before buying the house. The old woman who sold it had just mentioned it needed work, and had been in her family for generations. We thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but what would we say? There were no bones, no blood, nothing that proved anything had happened in that room. Just a chair, a chain, and scratches that seemed to tell their own story. Tom decided we should seal it back up. He said it wasn't our problem, and we didn't need to bring trouble onto ourselves. I wasn't sure if that was the right call, but I didn't argue. We left the basement that night and didn't go back for a few days. When we returned, something felt different. The house was colder, the air thick with a damp smell we hadn't noticed before. Tom worked upstairs while I cleaned tools in the kitchen. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving below us. Slow, dragging sounds like something heavy being pulled across concrete. I told myself it was just the old pipes or the wind through broken windows. But when Tom finally came back upstairs, his face was tight and pale again. He said he heard something too. We locked the basement door and nailed it shut, promising not to open it again. That night, Tom stayed at my place. Neither of us slept much. We kept going over what we'd found, trying to make sense of it. Why brick it up? Why leave it there at all? It felt wrong, and no matter how we talked about it, there were no good answers. The next day, Tom called someone to brick up the wall properly. He paid extra to have it done fast and made sure it was sealed tight. But even after that, he didn't like being in the house alone. After a while, he decided to sell it without finishing the renovations. I asked if he told the buyer about the basement. He said no, and I didn't press him on it. Some things are better left alone. But every time I pass that house, I wonder about the room behind the wall. Whether the scratches ever stopped, or if something is still down there, waiting. Story 20. I decided to camp near the old asylum because it was cheap and secluded. The place had been abandoned for decades, sitting at the edge of a dense forest. Locals told stories about it, mostly warnings to stay away, but I figured they were just trying to scare outsiders. I liked being on my own, and the grounds around the asylum were flat and quiet. I pitched my tent just as the sun began to set. The building loomed behind me, tall and gray, with its windows broken out like hollow eyes. Vines crawled up the sides of the walls, twisting around rusted metal bars that once kept people in. Despite the uneasy feeling in my chest, I told myself it was just another building, nothing more. As dusk settled in, I lit a small fire and heated up a can of soup. The forest was unusually silent. No birds, no crickets. Just the crackle of my fire and the faint rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. That quietness pressed in around me, and after a while I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder toward the asylum. That's when I saw the smoke. Thin gray ribbons rising from one of the chimneys on the far side of the building. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe mist rolling in from the woods. But the smoke was steady, curling up into the darkening sky. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the building. The closer I got, the more I noticed things I hadn't before. There were faint footprints in the dirt, leading toward a side door. The door itself hung crooked on one hinge, but looked like someone had recently forced it open. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with damp and rot, my flashlight beam caught on peeling paint and rusted fixtures. I followed the smell of smoke down a long hallway, past empty rooms with collapsed ceilings. My boots crunched on broken glass, each step echoing in the emptiness. I found the fire in what had once been a common room. A makeshift fire pit sat in the middle of the cracked tile floor, ringed by old bricks. The fire had been extinguished not long before I arrived, smoke still curled from the blackened wood. Nearby, there were several cans of food neatly stacked, their labels still clean and bright. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, or was close by. I shined my flashlight around the room but saw no sign of anyone. A battered backpack leaned against the wall, half zipped with clothes stuffed inside. There was a blanket laid out, surprisingly clean, like someone had been living there. I felt exposed standing in the middle of that room. I backed away slowly, keeping my light steady on the doorway. As I turned to leave, I heard something above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor overhead. Dust drifted down from the ceiling in soft puffs with each step. I didn't wait to see who it was. I moved fast, heading back the way I came, but the building was like a maze. Hallways looked the same. Doors led to dead ends. I thought I was retracing my path, but I ended up in a wing I hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with old metal bed frames, twisted and rusted, like cages. The air smelled wrong here, sharp, like metal, and something sour beneath it. My flashlight flickered as I passed what looked like an old nurse's station. Papers lay scattered on the floor, too faded to read. Another sound reached me, then breathing, slow and steady, not far behind. I ducked into a room and pressed my back to the wall. I held my breath, trying to quiet my pounding heart. The footsteps moved past the door, slow and heavy. They paused just outside, then continued down the hall, with a scraping sound, like something being dragged. When I was sure the hall was empty again, I crept back out and made my way toward the entrance. It felt like it took forever to find the door again. When I finally stepped back outside, the sky was darker than I remembered. My fire at camp had gone out, nothing left but cold ashes. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with the zipper pulled tight, listening. I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the grass once or twice, but I couldn't be sure. At some point I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. I packed up fast. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, I noticed something placed neatly by the cold fire pit, one of the canned foods I had seen inside the asylum. It was upright, its label facing me, as if someone had left it there on purpose. I left the can where it was and walked quickly back to my car. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every so often, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me down the empty road. Later that week, I looked up more about the asylum. There were rumors about people living there, squatters or drifters, but nobody really knew. Some said strange things happened to those who stayed near it too long. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but sometimes I still think about that fire and the food left by my camp. I wonder who lit the fire that night and who was still inside when I arrived. Sometimes I wake up from dreams where I hear the sound of footsteps and breathing just outside my door. Other times I swear I can smell smoke, faint but distinct, curling through my apartment in the dark. Story 21. The farmhouse sat on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by fields that had long since gone fallow. I had found it listed online, advertised as a quiet place to spend a night away from the city. The photos showed worn wooden floors and antique furniture, exactly the kind of rustic charm I was looking for. It wasn't expensive, and the owner said I could let myself in since they didn't live on the property. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds threatening rain. The house was older than I'd expected, its white paint chipped and peeling, windows clouded with grime. The porch creaked under my feet as I made my way to the front door. I found the key under the mat, just like the owner had said, and let myself inside. The interior smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but it wasn't unpleasant. Furniture covered in white sheets hinted at a house long unused, though a few pieces had been uncovered to make it livable. There was a couch, a small table, and a single bed in what must have once been the sitting room. I set my bag down by the door and walked through the house, familiarizing myself with its layout. The house was quiet except for the occasional groan of settling wood. I checked the windows and doors, finding them all locked just as the owner had promised. As night fell, I cooked myself a simple meal on the old stove and sat at the table, eating in silence. The wind picked up, brushing against the windows like fingers tapping the glass. By the time I decided to turn in, the storm had started. Rain rattled against the windows, and distant thunder rolled across the sky. I lay on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. The occasional creak from the walls made it hard to relax, but I eventually drifted off to sleep. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The wind was still blowing, and the rain still fell in steady sheets. But then I heard something else. A soft click, sharp and distinct, like the sound a camera shutter makes. It came from somewhere in the room. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight through the window. I couldn't see anything out of place. I listened hard, holding my breath, but heard nothing else. I told myself it was just the house, some mechanical sound I wasn't used to, and lay back down. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing in the shadows, watching me, but there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, I finally managed to fall back asleep, though it was restless and thin. When morning came, the storm had passed. Pale light streamed through the windows, and the air smelled fresh after the rain. I got out of bed and stretched, still feeling unsettled from the night before. I decided to make coffee before packing up and leaving. That was when I saw it. Pinned to the inside of the front door was a photograph. It was square and glossy, like a Polaroid, held in place by a rusty nail. I walked over and pulled it free, my hand shaking slightly as I turned it over. It was a picture of me, lying in bed, taken from the foot of the mattress. My face was turned to the side, my body relaxed in sleep. The angle suggested someone had been standing there, close enough to touch me. I felt cold all over as I looked at the image, unable to tear my eyes away. I hadn't taken this photo. There was no camera in the house that I had seen. I looked around quickly, my breath coming in short gasps. The house was empty, silent except for the groaning of its old frame. I checked the front door, but it was still locked from the inside. I rushed to the windows, examining them for signs they had been opened, but they were sealed tight. There was no sign of a break-in. I gathered my things as quickly as I could. My hands shook as I shoved clothes back into my bag. I checked every room one more time, half expecting to find someone hiding in a closet or crouched behind a door. But I found nothing. The house was as empty as it had been when I arrived. Stepping outside, I locked the door behind me and dropped the key back under the mat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was watching from one of the dark windows. The field stretched out around me, empty and silent. There was no movement, no sound but the crunch of my boots on the gravel path. Driving away, I kept looking at the photograph sitting on the passenger seat. I didn't know why I had taken it with me. Maybe I needed proof that it had happened. Maybe I thought if I kept it, I could figure out who had taken it and why. But the longer I stared at it, the more I realized I didn't want to know. I never went back to that farmhouse. A week later, I checked the listing online, but it had been removed. I tried to contact the owner, but the phone number had been disconnected. The email I had used bounced back, undeliverable. It was as if the place had vanished, like it had never been there at all. At night, sometimes I wake to the sound of a camera shutter. I search my apartment, checking every room, but there's never anyone there. Still, Every morning I check the door, afraid I'll find another photo waiting for me. So far, there's been nothing, but I know it's only a matter of time. Story 22. The old train station sat at the edge of town, long abandoned and nearly forgotten. Its cracked windows and rusted iron beams loomed like bones of something long dead. I had passed it for years, always curious but never brave enough to go inside. One afternoon I finally decided to explore, drawn by a mixture of boredom and something I couldn't quite name. The front doors were chained shut, but a gap in one of the side walls gave me easy access. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and old wood. The ticket booth still stood, glass long shattered, and faded posters clung stubbornly to the walls. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the station, the floor beneath me groaning with each step. I wandered through the waiting area, past rows of broken benches, and into what had once been an office. Papers were scattered everywhere, most too water-stained and brittle to make out. I took my time, snapping pictures on my phone, thinking I might post them later. The place was eerily quiet, except for the occasional drip of water somewhere in the distance. Near the back of the station, I found a door that hung crooked on its hinges. Beyond it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated only a moment before using my flashlight and descending slowly. The basement smelled damp and stale, and the concrete walls were stained with something dark in places. At the bottom, I found what must have been a storage room. Shelves lined the walls, but most were empty or broken. As I panned my flashlight over the floor, something caught my eye. One of the boards near the far wall looked newer, cleaner, as though it had been replaced recently. My curiosity piqued, I crouched down for a closer look. It didn't take much effort to pry the board loose. Underneath, I found a shallow space hollowed out between the floor joists. At first, it looked like trash stuffed into the gap: old wallets, torn scraps of leather, and plastic cards. But as I pulled them out and dusted them off, a sick feeling crept over me. There were dozens of wallets, and inside each one was an ID. I sat back, my hands shaking as I read the names and faces on the cards. Some were faded, others looked almost new. I recognized a few of them. People who had gone missing from town over the last few years. People whose faces had been on flyers taped to telephone poles and bulletin boards. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds, the weight of the discovery pressing down hard on my chest. I gathered a few of the wallets and stuffed them into my backpack, intending to take them straight to the police. But as I stood up, I heard something upstairs. A soft scrape, like a foot dragging across the floor above me. I froze, listening. Another sound followed, something heavy shifting. I switched off my flashlight and stood there in the dark, my heart pounding in my ears. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. Slow, deliberate footsteps made their way toward the basement stairs. I backed away slowly, feeling my way along the wall until I found another door at the far end of the room. It was jammed, but with enough force, I managed to push it open just enough to slip through. Beyond was another narrow hallway, leading to what looked like an old freight entrance. I moved as quietly as I could, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Behind me, I could still hear the footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. I finally reached the freight door, but it was bolted from the outside. I had to find another way out. Turning back, I found another staircase, this one leading up to the loading platform. I climbed quickly, wincing at every creak of the old wood. I pushed open a rotted door and found myself back in the main terminal, near the broken benches. The place was still empty, but I had the feeling I was being watched. I ran for the gap in the wall where I'd come in, not looking back until I was outside in the daylight again. Even then, I didn't stop. I sprinted all the way back to town, not slowing down until I was blocks away from the station. Only then did I stop and try to catch my breath, my hands still shaking. At the police station, I handed over the wallets and told them everything I had found. They listened quietly, taking notes as I described the room and the footsteps I had heard. They sent officers out to the station within the hour, but when they returned, they told me there was nothing there. The floorboards I had pulled up were intact, as if no one had touched them in years. The police assured me they would look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe a word I said. They logged the wallets as evidence, but gave no indication they planned to investigate further. I left feeling frustrated and more scared than I had been inside that station. I never went back there, not even during the day. But I kept thinking about those IDs, the people who had vanished without a trace, and the footsteps that had followed me that day. Sometimes when I'm walking home late at night, I hear that same slow scrape behind me, just out of sight. Story 23. The old church sat on the edge of a field, its white paint peeling and wood weathered gray by the years. I had passed it a few times on my way through town, always telling myself I'd stop and take a look. That afternoon, with nowhere else to be and hours of daylight left, I finally pulled over. The place looked abandoned, but something about it made me curious. The front door creaked open with little effort. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. Light filtered in through stained glass windows, their colors faded but still casting faint patterns on the worn pews. It was quiet, except for the faint groan of the building settling in the wind. I walked slowly down the center aisle, taking in the scene. The pulpit stood at the far end, simple and unadorned, save for a thick layer of dust. On top of it sat a journal, its cover cracked and brittle. Something about it felt out of place, as if it had been waiting there for me. I wiped my hand across the cover, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The journal was heavier than I expected when I picked it up. Its pages were yellowed and stiff, but the ink was surprisingly dark and clear. On the first page was a list of names written neatly in columns. Next to each name was a date and a time. I flipped through the pages slowly, seeing the same pattern again and again. Names I didn't recognize, each marked with a day and hour. Some of the entries had notes beside them, short phrases I couldn't make sense of, like gone before sundown or didn't wait. The further I flipped, the more unsettled I felt. My hands grew damp, leaving faint smudges on the dry paper. I reached a page where the handwriting changed slightly, like someone else had taken over, and that's when I saw my own name. It was there, as clear as anything, in dark ink. Next to it was today's date. The time listed beside it was the exact moment I had stepped inside the church. I stared at it for a long time, trying to find an explanation. I had never been here before, never signed anything, never told anyone I planned to visit. I set the journal back down on the pulpit, my hands trembling slightly. I told myself it was a coincidence. Someone else with my name. A prank, maybe. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. I turned to leave, my boots scuffing loudly on the wooden floor. The air felt heavier now, thick and still. When I reached the door, I grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't move. I yanked harder, but the door held fast, as if something on the other side was keeping it shut. I took a step back, then turned toward the windows. Maybe I could get out that way. As I moved, I thought I heard something faint behind me. A soft sound like pages turning slowly. I didn't want to look, but I did. The journal on the pulpit was open again. The pages were flipping on their own, stopping a few from the end. I could just make out the faint scratch of something being written. I forced myself to walk back toward it, even though every part of me wanted to run. When I got close enough to see the page, I felt my stomach drop. My name was there again, but this time with a second entry. It listed a time that hadn't come yet, about an hour from now. There was a short note beside it, written in the same clear hand, left through the side door. I hadn't noticed a side door. I looked around quickly, scanning the walls. On the far side of the room, half hidden by shadow, was another doorway. I had missed it completely when I first came in. I moved toward it, my footsteps echoing louder now. The side door was closed, but it wasn't locked. It opened with a long, low creak that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Beyond it was a narrow hallway that stretched toward the back of the church. There was no light, only darkness that seemed to press in close as I stepped inside. I used my phone's flashlight, its weak beam catching glimpses of old furniture and dusty walls. The hallway twisted once, then ended at another door. This one was slightly open, and through the gap I could see faint daylight. I moved faster, almost running, and shoved the door wide. It led out to the back of the church, facing the overgrown field. The sky looked darker now, though it couldn't have been more than late afternoon. I walked quickly away from the building, feeling a cold weight between my shoulders as if someone was watching me. When I got back to my car, I locked the doors and sat behind the wheel for a long moment. I kept looking at the church, waiting for something or someone to respond. Nothing did. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the journal, about the names and times, about how mine had been listed there, even though I had never set foot in that place before. I wondered what happened to the others, whose names filled the pages before mine. A few days later, I drove back past the church. The building was still there, but the door I had used was closed tight. I didn't stop this time. I kept going, though part of me wanted to know if the journal was still there, and if my name had another entry. I decided I was better off not knowing. Story 24. The building had been empty for years, its windows dark and broken, and its concrete walls stained with rust and weather. I had driven past it dozens of times, always wondering what it looked like inside. One cloudy afternoon, I finally decided to find out. I parked a few blocks away, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and slipped through a gap in the fence that surrounded the lot. The front entrance was chained shut, but one of the side doors was hanging loose on its hinges. I stepped carefully through the doorway and found myself standing in a wide, empty lobby. Debris littered the floor, papers and pieces of ceiling tile scattered everywhere. It was quiet inside, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. I moved slowly, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam over cracked walls and overturned chairs. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. My footsteps echoed off the empty walls, too loud in the stillness. The farther I walked, the more I wondered why the place had been abandoned so suddenly. I climbed a flight of stairs to the second floor, where rows of cubicles stretched into the darkness. Most of them were empty, just broken desks and shattered computer monitors. But as I walked farther in, I noticed one cubicle that still had things neatly arranged on the desk. A coffee mug, a notepad, and an old tape recorder. The tape recorder was turned on. The little wheels inside spun slowly as the tape moved, and from its tiny speaker came the sound of heavy breathing. It was slow and deliberate, as though whoever had made the recording was standing just out of sight, trying to control their breath. I stared at it for a moment, not sure what to think. Then, between the breaths, I heard a voice. It was low, a whisper just above the sound of the breathing. At first I couldn't make out what it was saying, but when I listened closer, my skin went cold. It was my name. My full name, whispered slowly, over and over again. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest. I had never told anyone I was coming here. No one even knew I had planned to explore the building. There was no reason for anyone to have made that recording. I turned off the recorder and yanked the tape out, holding it in my hand like it might burn me. For a few seconds, everything was silent again. Then I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the row of cubicles, but there was no one there. The sound stopped the second I moved. I stood there, holding my breath, trying to listen for anything else. I decided to leave. My nerves were already on edge, and the last thing I needed was to panic and get hurt trying to get out. I turned toward the stairwell, but when I reached it, the door was closed. I was sure I had left it open when I came through. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like someone was holding it shut from the other side. I backed away, looking for another way down. There was an elevator at the end of the hall, and I ran toward it, hoping for an emergency exit nearby. The lights on the elevator panel were dead, but as I passed, I noticed something scrawled on the wall in black marker. It was my name again, written over and over, covering the wall from top to bottom. I kept moving, feeling my chest tighten with every step. At the far end of the hall, I found another staircase. This one was open, and I bolted down the steps 2 at a time. Halfway to the first floor, I thought I heard that breathing again, faint and close, echoing down the stairwell with me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I reached the lobby, I ran straight for the door I'd come in through. It was still cracked open, the rusted hinges groaning as I shoved it wide and stumbled outside. The air smelled clearer out here, but I didn't slow down until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for several minutes before I could even start the engine. When I got home, I threw the tape in the trash and told myself to forget about it. But that night, as I was lying in bed, I thought I heard breathing again, slow and heavy, just outside my window. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, or maybe my imagination, but I didn't sleep. Over the next few days, things kept happening. I would find my name written on scraps of paper I hadn't touched. Once I found it scrawled in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. The breathing followed me, soft at first, but always there when I was alone in the quiet. I never went back to that building. I don't even drive by it anymore. But I can't forget the sound of that tape recorder, or the feeling that someone had known I was coming long before I ever stepped inside. And sometimes, when the house is dark and the night is quiet, I still hear my name being whispered. Story 25. It was supposed to be an easy job. The town paid me to clear brush and keep the grounds tidy at the old cemetery just outside of town. Most of the graves were from over a century ago, and hardly anyone visited anymore. The grass was knee-high when I started, and it took me a few days just to clear the front path. By the end of the first week, I'd made good progress. The place was quiet, peaceful even, except for the occasional sound of birds in the trees. The headstones were worn and crumbling, names barely visible on most of them. It was the kind of work you didn't think much about after the day was done. One afternoon, I reached the back section of the cemetery, an area hidden by a thick row of hedges. The grass was taller there, and several of the stones had fallen over completely. I worked my way through, clearing slowly, until something caught my eye. There was a patch of fresh earth, darker than the rest. At first, I thought it was a sinkhole, but when I got closer, I saw it was a grave, freshly dug. The dirt was piled neatly at one end, and the hole was deep and clean-cut. It was the kind of work someone would have done recently, maybe even in the past day or two. I checked the logbook I carried. There were no scheduled burials. No one was supposed to have been here but me. A cold feeling settled in my stomach as I stood there, staring at that open grave, its edges sharp against the rough ground. I left early that day, telling myself I would talk to the caretaker in town about it the next morning. My cabin wasn't far from the cemetery, just down the old service road. It was small and simple, but it was all I needed for the summer. I made dinner and tried to shake the image of the grave from my head. That night, I woke up just past midnight. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it. A soft, steady scraping sound. It was coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening as it continued, the slow rhythm of digging. I got up and crossed to the window, careful not to make any noise. The moon was bright, casting pale light over the clearing behind the cabin. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was there, clear and deliberate, metal scraping against dirt. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf by the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold, and the woods were silent, except for that steady sound. I shined the light toward where I thought it was coming from. The beam caught something pale, a hand moving quickly, digging into the earth. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Then the hand stopped, fingers curling as if it sensed the light on them. Slowly, it withdrew into the darkness, and the digging stopped. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like a long time, but nothing else happened. I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat with the flashlight in one hand and a heavy wrench in the other, waiting for the sound to start again. But the rest of the night was quiet, like nothing had ever been there. The next morning, I went out behind the cabin. There was a hole, freshly dug, about the size of a grave. My stomach turned as I stared down into it. It wasn't there the day before. There were marks in the dirt, like fingers had clawed at the edges after the digging was done. I drove into town as fast as I could and found the caretaker, Mr. Halpern. He was in his 70s, had worked at the cemetery most of his life. When I told him what I found, he got quiet. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette, staring out the window for a long time before he spoke. "You shouldn't have gone back there," he said finally. "That part of the cemetery, we don't tend it. Haven't in years. People say strange things happen in the back lot. We leave it alone." He looked at me then, his eyes pale and tired. "You should leave it alone too." I wanted to quit right then, but it was my job and I needed the money. Against my better judgment, I went back. I avoided the back lot for a couple of days, focusing on the front half of the cemetery. But something kept pulling at me. Curiosity, or maybe something else. On the third day, I found another fresh grave. This one was newer, the dirt still damp. There was no marker, no sign anyone had been there. That night I heard the digging again. Closer this time, right under my window. I didn't go outside. I didn't shine a light. I just lay there, holding my breath, listening to the sound of hands or tools cutting into the earth. In the morning there was another hole. This time it was directly beside my cabin, like it was following me. I left the job a few days later. I packed up and drove away without saying a word to anyone. I didn't want to explain what I saw or what I heard. I just knew I had to go. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still think I can hear that sound. The slow, steady scrape of digging in the dirt. Story 26. I spent the weekend at a restored farmhouse that belonged to an old friend of the family. They had invited me out to get away from the city and promised peace, quiet, and a chance to unwind. The house sat alone at the edge of a wide field, surrounded by woods that stretched for miles. It was beautiful in a plain, quiet sort of way, but something about its isolation made me uneasy from the moment I arrived. Inside, everything had been carefully redone to keep the old charm while making it livable. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, polished smooth by time and hands. The floors creaked underfoot in a way that seemed too loud in the stillness. Despite the cheerful rugs and warm lamps, the house felt cold. It was the kind of cold that seemed to settle under your skin, no matter how many blankets you used. The first night passed without much incident. I read a little, made myself tea, and fell asleep early. The second day I spent walking through the nearby woods and sitting on the back porch, listening to the wind. It was the kind of quiet that made you think about things you usually ignored. In the late afternoon, I decided to explore the house a bit more, just to satisfy my curiosity. The attic door was at the end of the upstairs hallway. I hadn't noticed it before, maybe because it blended in with the paneling. The latch was stiff, and I had to tug hard to get it open. A narrow set of stairs rose into darkness, the air cooler than the rest of the house. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and climbed up. The attic smelled like old wood and dust. Slanted beams ran low overhead and cobwebs draped from the corners. It was mostly empty, just a few broken chairs and old trunks pushed up against the walls. But then I turned toward the far end and saw the shoes. Dozens of them, arranged in neat rows by size, each pair lined up carefully on the wooden floor. Most of them were children's shoes, small, scuffed sneakers, leather boots with worn soles, Mary Janes with buckles dulled by time. A few of the shoes were adult-sized, but not many. The arrangement was strange, too precise, as if someone had spent hours deciding exactly where each pair should go. I moved closer and noticed something darker about them. Some of the shoes were still dirty, though there was no dust on them. Mud clung to the soles of a few, dried hard. Others were stained with something darker. The more I looked, the clearer it became that some of the stains weren't mud at all. They were reddish-brown, crusted and thick in places. My stomach twisted, and I had to kneel down to be sure of what I was seeing. On one of the smallest shoes, a white canvas sneaker, the stains covered almost the entire side. The laces were stiff, knotted with dried blood. It wasn't old, either. It hadn't had time to turn dark brown or flake away completely. It looked fresh enough that I pulled my hand back instinctively, as if it might still be wet. I stood up quickly, the air feeling thinner now. I backed away from the rows of shoes, but something caught my eye on the far wall. It was a set of old photographs, tacked up unevenly. Faded black and white images of children. Some of them smiling, others looking stiff and uncomfortable. None of them looked older than 10. Scrawled under each photo was a name and a date. The dates went back decades. One picture was newer, the paper less faded. A little boy stood in front of what looked like the farmhouse. He was holding a toy truck, his face serious. The date under his name was less than 5 years ago. I stared at it for a long time before I realized his shoes matched a pair near the front of the row. The blue sneakers with the white stripes. I took a step back and bumped into something behind me. It was a trunk, half hidden under an old sheet. The lid was unlocked, and for reasons I can't explain, I lifted it. Inside were more shoes. These weren't arranged. They were piled together haphazardly. A few of them still had socks tucked inside, and one or two looked like they had bits of dirt or worse stuck to them. I dropped the lid and stumbled back toward the stairs. The attic felt too small now, the slanted ceiling pressing in on me. I made it down the stairs and slammed the attic door shut behind me, bolting the latch even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. My hands shook as I leaned against the wall, trying to think. I grabbed my bag and threw it into the car without bothering to pack properly. I didn't leave a note. I didn't call my friend. I just drove away from that farmhouse as fast as I could, not stopping until I hit the main road. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind me. Someone. Later that night, back in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs. I wondered about the names and how many families had lived in that farmhouse over the years. I looked through old records, but there wasn't much to find. Just mentions of owners selling the place quickly or families moving out without explanation. I still wonder who arranged those shoes, who took the photographs, and how many more there might be waiting in boxes or under sheets in attics that no one thinks to check. Story 27. The mansion had been empty for years, a blackened skeleton on the edge of town. People said the fire had gutted it in less than an hour, leaving only charred walls and broken glass. I'd always wanted to see it up close, to walk through what was left and see if any pieces of the past were still there. One overcast afternoon, I finally slipped through a hole in the fence and made my way to the front entrance. The air inside was heavy with smoke even after all this time, and my boots crunched over debris as I stepped into the foyer. Most of the floorboards were scorched, cracked beneath my weight, and the wallpaper hung in curling sheets from the walls. I moved slowly, careful not to let my flashlight bounce too wildly in the darkened halls. Every window was broken, leaving long shards of glass hanging like teeth in the frames. I explored the lower floor first. Most of the rooms were empty, except for a few pieces of furniture that had been reduced to piles of ash and splinters. The kitchen was nothing but a blackened ruin, metal fixtures melted and warped beyond recognition. I stood for a while in the dining room, looking at the scorched remains of what must have once been a grand table, then decided to try the second floor. The staircase was surprisingly intact, though the railing was missing in places. I climbed slowly, testing each step before putting my full weight down. At the top, the hall stretched out in both directions, thick with soot. I picked a direction and started opening doors one by one, finding nothing but burned-out rooms, ceilings collapsed inward, and piles of debris that blocked my way. But at the end of the hall, there was one door that stood out. The paint wasn't scorched, and the wood looked clean, as though the fire hadn't touched it. I pressed my hand against it and felt a strange warmth, not from heat, but something else I couldn't place. I turned the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it opened easily, swinging inward with a faint creak. The room was completely untouched. The walls were painted a soft blue, and the carpet was pale gray with no signs of soot or ash. A small bed sat against one wall, the covers neatly made, and shelves lined with children's books and stuffed animals filled the opposite side. There was no dust, no damage, as though the room had been frozen in time the moment before the fire started. What caught my attention most were the toys. Dozens of them stuffed animals, dolls, plastic figures were all arranged in a half circle, facing the doorway where I stood. Their button eyes and painted faces stared at me, unmoving but somehow full of expectation. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I took a cautious step inside. The air was still, thick with silence. I walked slowly toward the toys, feeling their eyes on me with every move I made. I knelt by a teddy bear, its stitched mouth curved in a faint smile, and reached out to touch it. The fabric was warm beneath my fingers, almost like it had been sitting in sunlight, though there was no window in the room. I stood and crossed to the closet, its white wooden door closed tight. What struck me immediately was the lock. It was a sliding bolt on the outside, but it had been thrown from the inside. I tugged on the handle gently. It didn't budge. The bolt held fast, as though someone had locked themselves in and never come out. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. At first, I heard nothing. Then something faint, like a soft rustle of fabric or maybe breathing. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I considered calling out but couldn't bring myself to speak. The silence seemed too thick, like it might swallow any words I dared to make. I circled the room again, looking for any other clues. There were drawings on the walls, crayon pictures of smiling families and sunny skies, but in one corner, the drawings were darker. Stick figures with black scribbles over their faces, houses with flames drawn in red crayon. One picture showed a closet door with long black lines reaching out from the gap beneath it. I tried the closet door one more time, pushing harder, but it wouldn't give. I slid the bolt free, feeling it resist like it didn't want to move. The door swung open an inch, and cold air rushed out, washing over me with a scent like old earth and something metallic. I pushed it open wider, shining my flashlight inside. The closet was empty, except for deep scratch marks carved into the walls and floor. Long, jagged gouges, as if someone had clawed at the wood over and over again. At the very back of the closet was a small hole in the floor, barely large enough for a child to crawl through. It was black inside, and when I leaned closer, I thought I heard something moving far below. I backed away and left the closet door open, the cold air still spilling out into the room. The toys on the floor seemed closer now, their heads turned ever so slightly as though they were watching what I did. I didn't stay to look any longer. I turned and walked quickly out of the room, down the hall, and back to the stairs. The house seemed darker on my way out. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing against me with every step I took. I didn't stop until I was outside again, breathing hard and looking back at the broken windows above. The untouched room was still there, hidden behind the blackened walls. I don't know why the fire spared that room, or who had locked themselves in that closet. Sometimes at night I think about the hole in the floor and what might be waiting at the bottom. I haven't gone back to the mansion since, and I don't plan to. Some doors are better left closed, no matter how curious you get. Story 28. The plantation house stood at the end of a long dirt road, its white columns streaked with age and grime. Vines curled up the sides of the building, and the windows, though dusty, glinted faintly in the weak afternoon sun. I had always been fascinated by old places like this, drawn to their quiet decay and the weight of their stories. When I heard they offered tours on weekends, I decided to go. The tour group was small, just a handful of people wandering quietly through the halls. The guide was a thin man with a soft voice who spoke of the house's history in practiced tones. He mentioned that no one had lived there since the 1950s, when the last family abandoned it. Supposedly, it had remained untouched ever since, only reopened for historical interest a few years back. As we moved through the rooms, I noticed how staged everything felt. The furniture was arranged just so, the floors swept clean of dust in high-traffic areas. Still, the air smelled musty, and there was a heaviness in the quiet spaces between the guide's words. Something about it made the hairs on my arm stand up. The group paused in the dining room as the guide talked about grand parties held there long ago. I drifted toward the staircase, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was paying attention. Without thinking too hard about it, I slipped away, my footsteps muffled on the worn runner as I climbed to the second floor. Upstairs, the air was colder. The hallway stretched long and dark, the only light filtering in from grime-smeared windows. Most of the doors were shut, but one at the far end stood slightly open. I moved toward it, telling myself it was harmless curiosity. Part of me knew better. The door creaked as I pushed it wider. Inside, the room didn't look like the others. There was no antique furniture, no velvet ropes or informational plaques. Instead, a bare mattress lay on the floor, the sheets crumpled and stained. Candles stood melted into saucers along the edges of the room, some burned all the way down, others only recently lit. I stepped inside, heart thudding in my chest. Along the wall were newspaper clippings tacked haphazardly, overlapping and curling at the edges. They were all about recent kidnappings in the area, young people gone missing without a trace. Some articles had photographs circled in red pen, and handwritten notes filled the margins. I scanned the headlines. The dates were only weeks old. My mouth went dry as I read the scribbled words beside one photo. Next. The image was of a woman who had disappeared last week, her smile frozen beneath the red ink slashed across the paper. Beneath the clippings was a small stack of notebooks, pages crammed with names, times, and locations. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. I froze, listening. They were slow and deliberate, moving closer. I backed away from the wall and glanced toward the door. It stood half open still, but beyond it was only darkness. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, as the footsteps stopped just outside. I held my breath, listening to the faint rasp of someone breathing on the other side. It lingered for a long moment before fading. I waited another minute, then crept toward the door and peered out. The hallway was empty again, but I didn't trust it. Moving quickly, I grabbed one of the notebooks and tucked it under my jacket. The pages crinkled against my chest as I crept back down the hall, every step too loud in the silence. I made it to the stairs without seeing anyone, but the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. When I reached the bottom, I slipped quietly back into the dining room. The tour was still going on, the guide speaking softly about a portrait hanging on the far wall. No one noticed I had left. I stood there for a few moments, pretending to listen, my pulse still racing. After a few minutes, I made my excuses and left the group, thanking the guide as I walked back toward the entrance. His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, and I thought I saw a flicker of something in his expression. I pushed through the front doors and stepped into the fading afternoon light. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, glancing up at the house one last time. The curtains in the second floor window shifted slightly, as if someone had just stepped away. I put the car in gear and drove off, my hands tight on the wheel. Later that night, I opened the notebook in the safety of my apartment. The writing was frantic, almost manic, but the details were clear. Dates and times matched reports I found online. Some of the entries described movements and routines of people who had later disappeared. Toward the end of the notebook was a list of names, including some I didn't recognize. At the very bottom was mine, circled twice. The entry beside it listed the date and time of the plantation tour. There was a final note under my name that made my blood run cold. Soon. I spent the next few hours checking every lock in my apartment. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, no matter how secure I made the place. Every shadow outside the window made me jump. Every sound seemed too loud, too close. The notebook still lay open on the table when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. The message was short. You shouldn't have gone upstairs. I stared at it, heart pounding. Then another message followed. I saw you. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the candles flickering in that upstairs room and the red circles around the photographs. I knew I couldn't go back to the plantation, but something told me it didn't matter. Whoever was watching already knew where to find me. Story 29. The cabin was exactly what I had hoped for. It was small but sturdy, sitting in a quiet clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The air was cool and fresh, and the silence stretched for miles in every direction. After months of stress, I was looking forward to a week with no noise, no people, and no obligations. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace and read a few chapters of a book before turning in early. The wind outside whispered through the trees, but nothing seemed out of place. When I woke up the next morning, I opened the door to let in some fresh air and saw something odd on the wooden porch. A small stack of rocks stood just outside the door. 5 of them, balanced perfectly on top of one another. They weren't large or threatening, but they hadn't been there the night before. I crouched down, inspecting them closely. The stones were smooth, as if they had been worn by a river, and they were stacked with such precision it was hard to believe they hadn't toppled over. I figured it was some kind of local tradition, or maybe a leftover marker from hikers. I brushed it off and carried the rocks a few yards away, scattering them in the tall grass. The rest of the day was uneventful. I hiked a little, made some dinner, and enjoyed the peace and quiet I had come for. The second morning, another pile of rocks was there. This time there were 7 stones stacked high, and they looked even more carefully balanced. I stood there for a while, staring at them. The forest around me was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy stillness that made the back of my neck prickle. That afternoon, I decided to visit the ranger station about 5 miles back down the gravel road. I figured it was worth mentioning, if only to satisfy my own curiosity. The ranger was an older man, his face deeply lined, and his expression unreadable as I explained what I had found. When I mentioned the stacked rocks, his eyes darkened. He nodded slowly and told me it was probably a warning. When I asked him who it was from, he shook his head and told me I didn't want to know. He suggested I pack up and leave the cabin, his tone more serious than I expected. I pressed him for details, but he wouldn't give me any. I drove back to the cabin feeling uneasy. Part of me wanted to leave, but another part of me was stubborn. Nothing had happened, not really. Just some rocks on the porch. Maybe it was a prank, maybe some weird local custom. I told myself it was nothing and stayed another night. The third morning, the pile was there again. 9 stones this time, taller than before. They swayed slightly in the breeze but didn't fall. I didn't touch them. I just stood there for a long time, staring at the way they seemed to defy gravity. Something about them felt deliberate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were counting up to something. That night, I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows. I turned off the lights and sat in the darkness, listening for anything unusual. Hours passed, the fire burning low, and I heard nothing but the wind outside. Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the ranger's face and the way his voice had dropped when he told me to leave. On the 4th morning, I woke up and didn't go to the door right away. I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the wooden grain, listening to my heartbeat thump heavy in my chest. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the door, the stack was there again. 11 stones this time, thin ones balanced in a way that seemed impossible. I didn't go near it. I grabbed my keys and threw my bag into the truck, my pulse racing. As I pulled out of the clearing, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The stones were still there, casting a long shadow in the morning light. The sense of relief I expected didn't come. At the ranger station, I found the same man. He wasn't surprised to see me. I told him I was leaving, and he nodded like he had known I would. I asked him again who had been leaving the stones. He stared at me for a long time, then finally spoke in a low, quiet voice. "Something old," he said. "Older than people. It's better if you don't ask." I drove the rest of the way down the mountain without stopping. Every now and then, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. The road stayed empty, but I didn't feel safe until I hit the main highway. Back home, I tried to forget about the cabin. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept thinking about the stones, about how they had been stacked with such purpose. Sometimes I'd find myself listening too closely to the quiet around me, waiting for something to happen. One morning, I stepped outside my apartment to grab the paper and stopped cold. There on the doormat was a small stack of rocks, 3 of them balanced perfectly. I stared at them for a long time, my hands trembling. I didn't touch them. I just went back inside and locked the door, telling myself it had to be a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Story 30. I was hired to clean out an old hospital on the edge of town. The place had been abandoned for years, and the new owners wanted everything cleared before they decided what to do with it. They handed me a set of blueprints so I wouldn't get lost in the maze of hallways. The job paid well enough that I didn't ask too many questions. Most of the hospital was exactly what you'd expect from a place left to rot. Peeling paint hung from the walls in long strips, and the floors were covered in dust and debris. I moved slowly through each room, packing up old equipment and tossing broken furniture into piles for disposal. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. After a few days, I started to know my way around the building. Each wing had its own feel. The west side, where the surgical suites were, was colder than the rest. The east wing, full of old patient rooms, was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I marked off every room as I went, making sure not to miss a single one. Late one afternoon, I was working near the south end of the hospital. According to the blueprints, there wasn't much there, just a few storage closets and a utility room. But as I walked the corridor, I noticed something odd. The wall between 2 rooms seemed to echo differently when I tapped it. I ran my hand along the faded wallpaper, feeling for seams. After a few minutes, I found a narrow crack I hadn't noticed before. It was almost invisible, but when I pushed, the panel gave way with a soft groan. Behind it was a door. The handle was old, but it turned easily enough and the door swung open into darkness. I hesitated, staring into the space beyond. It didn't make sense. This room wasn't on any of the maps. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The door creaked shut behind me, and I had to fight the urge to open it again and walk away. The room was small, no bigger than an average patient room. It was cleaner than it should have been, as if someone had been there recently. In the center was a metal bed frame, bolted to the floor. Fresh white linens covered the mattress, neatly tucked in at the corners. At first, I thought it was odd but not alarming. Then I saw the shackles. They were attached to the bed frame at each corner, heavy metal cuffs with thick leather padding. They looked new, no rust or dust on them. I stood there, staring, trying to understand why this room existed. I backed toward the door, but something caught my eye on the nightstand. A clipboard, with papers that looked fresh and unstained by time. The top page had a list of names and dates, but no explanations. Some of the dates were recent, within the last month. The air in the room felt heavy, as if it had closed in around me. I glanced at the walls and noticed they were thicker than in the other rooms, lined with soundproofing material. There was no window, no way for sound or light to get in or out. It was a cell disguised as a hospital room. I pulled out my phone to take a photo of the clipboard, but there was no signal. No bars, no nothing. I took the picture anyway and backed out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar behind me. My hands were shaking as I returned to the main corridor. I tried to keep working that day, but I couldn't focus. Every noise sounded closer than it should have been. Footsteps echoed behind me, but when I turned, the hallway was empty. I told myself I was imagining things, that old buildings made noises all the time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the bed, the shackles, and the names on the clipboard. I looked through the photos I had taken on my phone. The image of the clipboard was blurry, but I could make out a few names. They weren't random. Some of them belonged to people I recognized from town. I went back the next morning, even though I didn't want to. I told myself I would finish the job quickly and leave. When I got to the south corridor, the hidden door was closed again. I tried the handle, but it was locked. No matter how hard I pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. I didn't mention the room to the new owners when they came to inspect the progress. They walked through the halls, making notes and nodding, but they never asked about that part of the building. I wondered if they even knew it was there. On my last day, I packed up the last of the debris and loaded it onto a truck. Before I left, I walked past the hidden door one more time. Something had changed. The faint smell of bleach hung in the air, sharp and clean, masking the old mildew scent. It hadn't been there before. I drove away without looking back. For days after, I checked the news, expecting something to come up about the hospital. Nothing did. It was like that room and everything in it had never existed, except I still had the photo on my phone. Sometimes I think about the people on that list. I wonder where they went and why no one talks about them anymore. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I remember the sound of that door creaking open and the cold feeling that washed over me as I stepped inside.